Chapter 2374. Lu Xiaoyi began to concentrate on his sword Dao steel. Since he had started, he had to do it perfectly. It was not entirely for concealment, but also for the possibility of achieving Dao. Things that were purely spiritual did not have complicated details, nor did they have a huge spiritual system. It was simple to the point of being straightforward, direct to the point of being rude. It was to draw the sword. But the sword here was no longer a narrow flying sword, but a spirit that dared to question, to overthrow, and to innovate. It could be reflected in all aspects of cultivation. It was all-encompassing and all-encompassing. He was very clear that it was not the true essence of this spirit to hang on with the change of the era. Otherwise, once these people achieved their goal, once this period of time passed, they would give up this spirit. This was not the true spirit of Sword Dao. So, what he wanted to do here was to extend this spirit and become the spiritual guide of cultivation in the future era. This was not originally in his plan, but the popularity of the Sword Dao steel gave him a new understanding. He also saw the possibility of carrying out a spirit that could only exist in the short term. Humans were eager for quick success, especially in the face of huge temptation. He had a lot of things to do to turn a short-term impulse into a long-term spirit. From a tactical point of view, this was probably his best method of concealment. Regarding this, he did not try to hide it. Whether it was the old friends who came or the new friends who just came, he would tell them all his ideas completely, hoping to get the greatest support and help in the promotion of his ideas. Some refused, some did not agree, but most of the cultivators still had a supportive attitude. After reaching this level, their understanding of Dao was no longer superficial. The so-called vision of a great cultivator was not a joke. In this kind of contact, the sword Dao steel's Dao Qi canopy rose steadily, and still maintained a jaw-dropping growth rate. It became the most dazzling one in the land of the Yellow Dragon recently. It was not until a few years later that the growth rate began to slow down. But this did not mean that the potential of the sword Dao steel had been exhausted, but that the existing cultivators in the land of the Yellow Dragon had been exhausted. If they wanted to increase it, they could only wait for more cultivators to come. Unlike the other great Daos that were approved by the heavenly Dao and recognized by humans, the sword Dao tablet, which was a pure spiritual willpower type, had a very vague recognition from the heavenly Dao. Its existence was more supported by human cultivators. Therefore, the Dao Qi crown finally stopped at a height of 120,000 feet. It was still far from those innate Daos that had a strong foundation. It wasn't because there were fewer people supporting it, but because it lacked the recognition of the heavenly Dao. How to get the approval of the heavenly Dao was a very troublesome problem. Lu Xiaoyi did not start on the second and third steels. It was still early, and there was no need to be impatient. It was far from time to reveal his true intentions. On this day, he was meditating in the Dao steel when a familiar guest barged in. That's a good move. Just the sword Dao tablet alone has attracted so much attention. Just the side Dao is already so impressive. When the real Dao is brought out, I wonder what kind of scene it will be. The person who came was very polite. To him, it was not often that he complimented others. Lu Xiaoyi faintly smiled. Fellow Daoist Sen thinks too much. This is my righteous path. Thank you for reminding me of the fifth ring. It's very important to me. I can't thank you enough. I've been waiting for you for a long time, but I wonder why you're so late? Daoist Sen smiled. It seems like you've approved of this humble Daoist's qualifications for the exchange? Lu Xiaoyi did not avoid the question. It's not approval. It's just that you've already made your move, but I haven't yet. Daoist Sen understood that this swordsman was still on guard against him. He would rather exchange one thing for another than take credit. In other words, he could ask the swordsman for help this time, but if he asked again, he would have to show his sincerity. It was a very snobbish way of doing things, but for their current status, It was the safest and most practical way. At this point in their cultivation, they were only 2 steps away from ascending to immortality. Who would be willing to step into someone else's quarrels? Even if it wasn't a trap, it would still bring about karma. It would only do more harm than good. Based on his temperament, this swordsman's way of doing things was exactly what he wanted. If it was too intimate, he wouldn't be able to accept it. Thus, he didn't beat around the bush. Do you know anything about the netherworld? Lu Xiaoyi spread his hands. I know nothing. Daoists nodded. That's true. It's normal for cultivators from the lower realms to not know much about it, because it's something that the immortal court has been working on for the past several 100,000 years. It's something new, and it's neither perfect nor against the rules. It's a field that's still being explored. Since you don't know anything about it, I'll explain it to you. The 2 of them asked and answered questions in the sword Dao style, opening up a field that Lu Xiaoyi had never come into contact with in his entire life. The netherworld is a myth that first appeared in folklore. It's also a strange story in the human universe. In the mortal world, the stories of gods and monsters are usually just rumors spread by chance. The more widely it spreads, the more it adds in the mortal's own understanding of the cultivation world. In the eyes of true cultivators, it's very funny. In a top-notch cultivation realm like yours, there are very few such legends. That's because mortals usually come into contact with a lot of cultivation matters, and their lives are closely related to cultivation. When it's close to the truth, there are very few distortions, and it's not strange at all. However, this kind of universal cultivation realm is very rare. For the vast majority of human planets, low to no spiritual vigor is the mainstream. It's just that cultivators like you basically don't understand it because cultivators always have to move forward. There's no reason to turn back. Lu Xiaoyi nodded. He came from a lower 3 stars, so he could empathize with Daoists' words. In a planet with low spiritual vigor, it wasn't easy to see cultivators, so of course there was no way to understand it. Thus, it became a phenomenon that became more and more mysterious as it spread. Daoists smiled. But humans are such a strange race. Even if they can't cultivate and don't have the conditions to do so, their thoughts can still be as wild as a steed soaring across the sky. They can create a colorful world of gods and monsters for you. They can even create a system for you out of nowhere. Well, it's mainly those down-and-out literati who can't achieve high or low positions. They're good at writing, but they don't have the ability to pass the imperial examinations, and they don't have the strength to carry a plow into the fields. So they do their best to search for some scattered folklore in the mortal world and polish it themselves. They come up with a lot of jokes that make cultivators not know whether to laugh or cry. For example, do monsters necessarily eat humans? In fact, they don't know that since the beginning of cultivation, the number of monsters eaten by humans is countless times greater than the number of monsters eaten by humans. Chapter 2375. Lu Xiaoyi chuckled. Maybe they think that monsters like to bully mortals? Daoists snorted. Bully mortals? Then wouldn't it be worse for humans to bully mortal beasts? That's not the point. Humans have always thought of themselves as the highest level of living beings. Because they have words, because they have inheritances, because they no longer act on instinct. That's why humans think that it's normal for humans to eat beasts, because beasts aren't living beings in their eyes, but food. Of course, beasts can't eat humans, because humans are of a higher level, they're masters. Oh, I'm getting off track. Where was I? Lu Xiaoyi held back his laughter. This Daoist might be an old man of the immortal court. Even after becoming an immortal, he still had such independent thoughts. Just based on this point alone, he was worthy of being friends with. You just said that some destitute human literati rely on making up stories about immortals to earn a living. Daoists continued. Yes, I'm talking about them. But there's no shortage of such people in every realm. No matter where in the universe, no matter what nook or cranny, as long as there are people, there will be such writers. Don't underestimate the power of these people. I don't know how they do it, but their lousy stories and preposterous nonsense can actually break through the barriers of the void and spread certain legends to the entire universe. Lu Xiaoyi smiled. That might mean that there's a commonality in human imagination. Is the conscious and unconscious transmission of mortal culture also part of it? Taoists sighed. Among these nonsense, the most popular, most widespread, and most deeply rooted legend is the Netherworld Kingdom. Could it be that this originates from humans' fear of death? Their desire for reincarnation? Their pursuit of truth, kindness, and beauty? Their rejection of falsehoods? In any case, this legend is so widespread that it's even more widespread than the true legends of the cultivation world. Lu Xiaoyi was a little surprised. Could it be? Taoists snorted. Yes. Can you believe it? The wild imaginations of mortals can actually affect the thinking of golden immortals. Even those lousy pens could outline the future of the universe. Tens of thousands of years ago, for some unknown reason, a golden immortal proposed such an idea in Qingwei Heaven. The excuse was nothing more than to share joy with the people. If the human cultivation ecology was described as a closed loop, then golden immortals should be the group closest to mortals, and so on. Since the netherworld was so popular in the mortal world, and there was such a market for it, why not go with the flow and do as they wished? It was to truly establish such a place, to continue the system of those lousy pen holders, and to create the netherworld. The benefit is that it can free the hearts of ordinary mortals. They will no longer be filled with fear of death, and they will turn to good and evil. It will promote the karma of good and evil, and it will make the human world more harmonious and beautiful. Lu Xiaoyi was speechless, as expected of a golden immortal. His thinking is so high. Taoist Sin was disdainful. Superior? Tall. Later on, I understood that it was not the feelings of golden immortals and saints. It was that some people were worried about the future order of cultivation. Now it seems that they were worried that they would lose their privileges in the new era. Because cultivators have reincarnation, they can comprehend their previous lives, but mortals can't. They live a mediocre life and don't know what their previous lives were. They can only guess whether it was a horse or a cow, a pig or a dog, good or evil. Such a system has loopholes because it is not equal. It will affect the cornerstone of the entire great Tao of reincarnation. In order to change, in order to make up for the loopholes, the immortals figured out such a way to let mortals experience the pain and joy of reincarnation. In this way, the heavenly Tao can't find fault with reincarnation, and the cultivator's reincarnation cultivation can continue like this, and finally form a cultivation class. In the attempt to reincarnate in the mortal world, the netherworld appeared. Lu Xiaoyi was dumbfounded. There was actually such a thing. The underworld did not exist in the first place, but was simply a fabrication made up by mortals. In the end, the immortals used it for other purposes to consolidate their own reincarnation order. Was this a precautionary measure against the changing of the epoch? It might be and it might not be, because the reincarnation Tao was the Tao that was most affected by human factors among the existing innate Tao. It was also the Tao that was most likely to be taken advantage of. The rules of reincarnation were not naturally formed, but the product of millions of years of constant consideration, compromise by the golden immortals, especially the reincarnation Tao Master. It should be said that the immortals still had a sense of crisis. They had been vigilant about the existence of the reincarnation Tao since hundreds of thousands of years ago. Although the reincarnation Tao was insignificant in battle, it played an extremely important role in maintaining the order of cultivation. Lu Xiaoyi was somewhat incredulous. As you said, such a netherworld, under the control of the immortal court, is still not perfect after hundreds of thousands of years? Taoists smiled bitterly. This is not a realm. It is the entire universe of humans. Think about it, with such a massive scale, how are we going to establish a systematic underworld? Can it accommodate so many people, and it has to be similar to what those damned writers described? The key is, who is to be sent to manage such a netherworld? Lu Xiaoyi understood. Fellow Taoist, you are unwilling. Taoist's face was full of disgust. No one is willing. We were doing well in the immortal court, but we were demoted to that ghastly and dark place to manage some souls that should not exist in the world. Therefore, for hundreds of thousands of years, the managers of the netherworld were appointed by the immortal court, and they took turns to serve for 10,000 years. You can imagine how the immortals who were sent here felt. How could they do their best? The last batch was just in time for the change of era. Seeing that the immortal court was about to change, who would come to this nondescript place to waste time? When the new era came, it was hard to say whether the netherworld would still exist or not. Would we just stay here and wait for death? That's why I didn't want to come, so I was demoted to the lower realm. The story is unbearable to recall. This was the first time Lu Xiaoyi had heard of this secret of the immortal court. Indeed, he couldn't blame Taoists for rebelling against the immortal court. If it were anyone else, they probably wouldn't have come. They might as well have been demoted to the lower realm. At the very least, they would still have eyes and ears, and they could still come in contact with the cultivation world of the universe. There was still a chance for them to make a comeback. He was a little curious. What was the situation with this half-completed underworld? Although it was inappropriate to be curious about such a messy thing at this point in time, he could guess that Taoists had asked him to help with nothing more than this. It was hard to imagine that the immortal court had copied something that came from the imaginations of mortals just like that. However, he still had a lot of questions. Then, what kind of souls are in the netherworld? Are they ordinary people? Or do they include cultivators? Would all the dead go in and take a walk? Or do they have a choice? Chapter 2376. Taoists looked at him with admiration. This swordsman had hit the nail on the head. First of all, cultivators won't be in the same reincarnation law as mortals. That's our definition of entering the Tao. Once you start cultivating, you'll change your life. The immortal court defined it this way to encourage more people to cultivate. Secondly, not every mortal will enter the netherworld after death. They'll be too busy. When I was in the immortal court, I heard the true immortal seniors occasionally mention that the great Tao of reincarnation is the brightest in the Qingwei heavens. Because it's running at full power, it consumes a lot of energy and is very tired. Lu Xiaoyi laughed. He deserves it. Taoists also laughed. Originally, it was only controlling the reincarnation of cultivators, and mainly those above the Yuanying realm, so it was easier. Now it's great. When dealing with all the living beings in the universe, including humans and demon beasts, the workload is more than 1,000,000 times greater. Therefore, the Golden Immortal's original intention was to deal with all the living beings in the universe, but they soon adjusted it to only deal with humans. It still wasn't enough, and there were still too many. Therefore, they only took 10% of humans. If it was still too much, they reduced it again. Since the opening of the netherworld hundreds of thousands of years ago until now, reincarnation Tao Lord would shrink every once in a while when he couldn't take it anymore. Now, they only take 1/10,000th of a mortal's life and death. The 10,000th of the most evil and the 10,000th of the most kind and virtuous were sent into the netherworld as a testing ground in an attempt to find out the rules of the netherworld. When everything matured, they slowly expanded it and finally expanded it to the entire human race. Lu Xiaoyi was speechless. What kind of screening method is this? Shouldn't they choose the most universal people? Because most of the people in this world are ordinary people. You choose the 10,000th of the most evil and evil people, and then add in the 10,000th of the most kind and virtuous people. What will happen? Is there any guiding law? I can tell you that they all have one thing in common, and that is that they're all paranoid and only think about themselves. Daoists spread his hands. You consider the problem from the perspective of human nature, while the immortal court considers the problem from the perspective of management. Their positions are different, so of course their views are different. With the 10,000th of the most evil and the most kind people, you can find out the limit of the netherworld's punishment and reward the good. Otherwise, how did the 18 levels of hell come about? How would he be sentenced? How to institutionalize all of this? Refinement. Could it be that they really had to station the cultivators one by one to investigate the cases? In order to straighten out the relationship between hell and hell in a short period of time, Qin Yi would have to first establish a framework for the system, identify the boundaries of behavior, and then deal with the problems of most ordinary people. You're too idealistic, Superintendent. Lu Xiaoyi did not argue. It was meaningless. In fact, he was just guessing. His intuition told him that this was not the right thing to do. However, he had never been to the underworld, so he could not make any rash comment. After Daoist Sun briefly introduced the netherworld, he finally got to the point. The era is about to change. None of the immortals are in the mood to manage the netherworld, even if it's just for show. I didn't go, so I was demoted. The next one was worried about being punished by the immortal court, so I held my nose and went. In the end, I broke my Tao and was eliminated after a few hundred years. What bad luck! This time, the immortal court could no longer find fault with me, and no one took the initiative to resist. In the end, everyone pretended to be ignorant and let the netherworld be in a state of laissez-faire. In any case, it's only 1 or 2,000 years. When the new era begins, the netherworld will disappear on its own. No one can blame this rotten debt, and no one will be implicated. This is the current situation of the netherworld. Lu Xiaoyi was very curious. Then, who's in charge of the netherworld now? It can't be that the evil and the good are self-governing, right? Daoist Sun looked at him. This is why I'm here to ask for your help. I've been to the netherworld, and it's precisely because I hate the environment there that I've rejected it. But it's also because I've been there that I'm very worried about the current situation of the netherworld. He sighed. The immortal court established the netherworld to achieve its goal through the expansion of the reincarnation system. First, everyone's 5 fortunes and 5 virtues were judged whether a person was good or evil. There was a very specific standard for how good they were and how evil they were. After all, it's impossible for there to be such an organization that has the ability to judge everyone's good and evil. Therefore, in the early days of the netherworld's establishment, this system was actually a huge project that involved the cooperation of many innate great Daos. But now, the 5 fortunes are gone, and a very important reference system is missing. Later on, the 5 virtues were also gone, and the netherworld became completely blind. Without the foundation to judge good and evil, how was the netherworld going to recruit people? In order to maintain the basic operation of the netherworld, it could only recruit people randomly. In other words, after the 5 virtues were completely destroyed, the netherworld's standard for recruiting people was no longer the best and the worst, but a random selection. The composition of the netherworld finally changed from the sharp opposition between good and evil to a 3-way tug of war, with ordinary people joining in the middle. That's when the trouble began. Daoist Sun explained, the immortal court sent the immortals to control the netherworld in order to get the result. They didn't dare to imagine that the immortals would really work here without complaint and do their best. Therefore, they only cared about their own cultivation in name and left the specific matters to their subordinate. The so-called subordinates are the things in the legends of the mortals, such as the 10 kings of hell, the ox-head and horse-face, the black and white impermanence, and so on. They all follow the script of the mortals. Don't they like this kind of thing? It's more ritualistic. As for how these people were selected, it's been a long time, and no one cares about it. It's probably because the immortals who were in charge of the first few rounds used some unknown method to find them, or maybe they just casually pointed at them and did it half-heartedly. After that, the immortals were too lazy to change. These so-called Netherworld's bureaucrats didn't dare to do anything to the immortals in charge. At least, they were respectful and obedient when it came to dealing with the immortals. They had some ability to do things, and so they continued to be in charge. These people were the ones in charge of the Netherworld. I don't know what they'll do without the supervision of the immortals, but based on my life experience, no matter if they're evil or good, once you give them a certain amount of power, they'll actually become the same kind of people. Taoist's expression became serious. The Netherworld is a very special place. It's a special space that the Golden Immortals specially set up for the souls of mortals. In order to achieve their goal, they put a lot of effort into it. According to the information I received, the Netherworld has been without an immortal for a long time, so the situation is very bad. If the mortals here are allowed to reincarnate, they'll hide their negative energy, which will be detrimental to the common people. They'll be the catalyst for disaster in the mortal world. I'll be honest with you. In order to succeed in becoming an immortal again, I need this kind of virtue. Therefore, I want to enter the Netherworld as a non-immortal and completely solve the hidden dangers of the Netherworld before the change of era. Are you willing to help me? Chapter 2377. Lu Xiaoyi knew he didn't have the right to refuse, and he didn't want to always owe someone a favor. It was too uncomfortable. Fellow Taoist, you don't have to ask whether I'm willing or not. Moreover, from what you've said, it might not be a bad thing for me? Senbai was very satisfied. Why did he ask this swordsman for help? Strength was one thing, but being honest, not putting on airs, and not being pretentious was another thing. The cornerstone of cooperation was honesty, and the worst thing to do was to pretend to be obedient. As for the matter of the Netherworld, if we can succeed, we'll be able to find a proper place for these souls, even if they aren't truly human anymore. That'll be a good deed. It'll be of great benefit to both of us. The era is about to change, and we're in the midst of establishing the Tao. It's not wrong for everyone to put all their energy into this, but it's because their vision isn't broad enough. I've been an immortal for 1,000,000 years, and while I don't dare to say that I understand everything, I still have a certain understanding of how the heavenly Tao operates. In my opinion, if you want to succeed in establishing the Tao, you'll have to do it not only within the Tao, but also outside it. Lu Xiaoyi nodded in agreement. Taoists smiled. The era is about to change, and the universe will experience countless calamities. This is the pain of the revolution, and it's unavoidable. For cultivators, it might affect their futures, but for mortals, it affects their lives. This kind of loophole can be found everywhere in the universe's revolution. Therefore, how we, those who dream of establishing the Tao, clean up the mess caused by the universe's changes is actually a very important part of obtaining the will of the heavens. Taoistsen was very frank, because he really did need this swordsman's help. Judging from this person's past, his ability to deal with complicated matters was astonishing. Not only was he strong, but he also had wisdom and methods. Every time he came up with a new pivot, it was refreshing. He needed this swordsman's sincere help, and not just going through the motions without putting in any effort. It's like the Fifth Ring's disaster. What Superintendent C did. He saved billions of lives. This isn't just for show, the will of the heavens can feel it. I've contributed to this, and I can also share the will of the heavens. This is another cornerstone of establishing the Tao. Most people can't understand this kind of cornerstone, so it's a waste of effort to stay here. The path of the Tao encompassed too many things. It wasn't just about the profundities of your Tao realm, it was also about how widespread it was, and how lofty one's intentions were. I reckon that with so many people studying each great Tao and learning from each other, the difference in Tao realms would be limited in the end. Then, if there is no difference in Tao realms, I'm afraid it would be a competition of things outside Tao. That's what you and I are going to do. Lu Xiaoyi sighed in his heart. There were no fools in this world of cultivation. What Senbai was doing was actually what he was going to do in the Heavenly Choice continent. It was the same thing, wiping the buttocks of the epoch change. As long as you wiped it clean, soaked it in hot water, and massaged it a few times, the chances of establishing your Tao would greatly increase. This was not because the Heavenly Tao was selfish, but because the Heavenly Tao was also using this opportunity to observe whether the person who established the Tao had the intention to be kind to the common people. Thus, he smiled and said, "Fellow Taoist, if you had said so earlier, why would we still talk about the exchange of benefits? It was all for one goal. You and I both have our own plans for the 5 rings. It's the same for the netherworld. In the future, I might have other troubles to look for fellow Taoist for the same reason." Senbai laughed. It was indeed comfortable to talk to smart people. There's more? When the time comes, feel free to ask. The more such things, the better. There's no reason to push it away. Put away the sword Tao tablet. At most a year, at least a few months. I will definitely come and look for you. Let's go to the netherworld and see what we can do for those ownerless souls. Wiping the buttocks of the golden immortals, I never thought I would have such an opportunity. Senbai laughed and left, leaving Lu Xiaoyi in deep thought. The simplest way to see if there were any changes was, Lu Xiaoyi released his own auspicious cloud. His auspicious cloud had never been deliberately strengthened or thickened. To a small universe body like him, the auspicious cloud would change as his great Tao expanded. Everything was up to fate and nature. He rarely used his auspicious cloud. It was not that the auspicious cloud was not useful, but that he had too many tricks up his sleeves. His attacks were too fast, to the point that he did not need the auspicious cloud's protection most of the time. After coming out of the cave, he had been busy. He did not have the time to observe the changes in his auspicious cloud. The auspicious cloud no longer had an obvious great Tao bias. Because he understood too much, the old connate great Tao and the new great Tao mixed together. The nature of the auspicious cloud began to develop in the direction of a true small universe. When the auspicious cloud condensed, Lu Xiaoyi immediately discovered some incredible changes. This was not the power of will, nor was it faith, nor was it incense. It was as if all of these had been mixed together. Then, through the reflection of a certain line of sight, the auspicious cloud became even denser. There was a sense of clarity in the dense cloud. Heaven, earth, and man were Taoist terms. In fact, at his level, the meaning of these 3 words had a deeper meaning. Heaven represented the heavenly heart and heavenly Tao. Earth represented the cultivation of cultivators. Man was everything in the mortal world. Everything he did in the 5 rings deeply affected the gaze of the heavenly heart and the recognition of the mortal world. This was extremely important for someone who wanted to change the order. Balance was everywhere. If you want to change, subvert, and reorganize the order, you have to bear the backlash of change. Virtue carries all things. Virtue can also change. This made him understand the crux of why the majority of changes would not succeed based on hot-bloodedness. It was because you did not have enough virtue to bear it. This virtue was not one's so-called noble and pure character, which was to be outstanding but to be pure, to rise from the mud but not be tainted. Instead, it was to actually do some things because the heavenly Tao was not blind. It could clearly distinguish the difference between talking and doing things. Senbai needed this to ascend to immortality. He needed it even more because he had to bear the backlash of subversion. It was also because of this understanding that he was even more clear that Qing Xian and Yan Chen would never succeed. Because they did not have enough virtue. This kind of virtue, He had been doing it all along. Even from Jean Dan onwards. It was a kind of intuition. He knew that he could do great things in the future, so he did his best to increase his virtue. This kind of accumulation did not happen overnight. It ran through his entire cultivation career. What kind of virtue was the most favored by the heavenly Tao? All round? Big enough? 10 billion in the 5 rings? 100 billion in the heavenly choice? Yes and no. There was another kind of virtue that was above all, and that was being consistent from beginning to end. Lu Xiaoyi had been doing this ever since he stepped onto the path of cultivation. Since he was thrown into the first boundary of the void of the universe, since Hasa planet, he had never stopped. It was not like he was in a hurry to make last-minute efforts when the new era was about to arrive. It was only intentional, so there was no end. This was his point of view. Did Taoists understand? Cultivation had already begun from the first day you stepped onto the path of Tao. Chapter 2378. I'm going to save the common people. These were the words Lu Xiaoyi left for his friends in the sword Tao steel. Although he knew it would provoke endless curses, he couldn't control his surging mischievous heart. With Qing Xian and the others around, the early preparations were no problem. Then, he would make a dazzling entrance and raise his arms. As a leader, he had to have the temperament of a leader. If he did everything, how would his subordinates earn a living? The two gathered outside the circular space. Daoistsen was wearing a loose robe. The plan he had been preparing for a long time was about to begin. This was also a very important part of his process of climbing up the rank. Just as he said, he needed to do his best to fight for the will of the heavens. The 5th ring was a good opportunity, but he couldn't take it all. He couldn't meddle with the bandits' domain at all. Although he was a half-immortal, he was once an immortal. The people of the 5th ring wouldn't care about him. Therefore, he could only give up this opportunity and give it to the native of the 5th ring, Lu Qing, while he took the secondary merit. However, this time, it was an opportunity that belonged solely to him. He was the master, and the sword cultivator was the secondary. Have you been to splendid heaven and earth? Lu Xiaoyi was startled. I have, and I'm quite familiar with it. Why, is the Netherworld Kingdom located there? Daoistsen nodded. Exactly. It's the largest mortal domain in the universe. It's much larger than your 5th ring. At present, it seems that only the Heaven's Choice continent is larger than it. However, Heaven's Choice won't last for long, so it's most suitable to set up the Netherworld Kingdom there. This was a realm of mortals, a true realm of mortals, an incomparably large mortal domain. The so-called true mortal domain referred to the fact that it wasn't a place for cultivation even in the ancient and primeval times. It wasn't like many other mortal realms, which were just products of cultivation planets that gradually fell behind. From the very beginning, there was no possibility of spiritual opportunity here. It wasn't in the past, it wasn't in the present, and it wouldn't be in the future. Therefore, everything in the mortal world was the same here. The people had no concept of cultivation from the root of their minds. Furthermore, there were scholars who condemned gods and monsters. This was destined to be a cultivation desert. It was precisely because of such an environment that it became the birthplace of countless legends of gods and monsters in the imagination of mortals. It was also a garbage dump for countless people to earn money through writing. He was a little surprised, but it was also reasonable. Let's meet at splendid heaven and earth, and enter the netherworld from there. It's the easiest place for us to enter in our current state. Otherwise, I'm afraid we'll die in there. Then you'll have a chance to taste Meng Po's soup. Speaking of which, these mortals are really imaginative. Who came up with the idea of Meng Po's soup? The two of them stood up as they chatted and laughed. Through the inner and outer scenic heavens, they began their journey to hell. Outside the splendid world, the two figures stood side by side. Daoistsen was very curious. This splendid land is a strange place. Once a cultivator enters, they will lose all their abilities. How did you enter back then? How did you get out? Lu Xiaoyi sneered. It's the Heaven's Eyes mission. Otherwise, I probably wouldn't have come here. I was wondering why my abilities were sealed so tightly back then. I thought that it was the work of a true immortal. Now, it seems that it was the work of a gold immortal. No wonder. Daoists nodded. Heaven's Eyes? Then that's right. No cultivator will enter this place voluntarily. Once they enter, how to get out is also a big problem. Without the guidance of an immortal from the outside, the cultivator who enters will have his abilities sealed. He will be immortal for the rest of his life. This is also the protection of the immortal court for the splendid land. Otherwise, how could it avoid the infiltration of the cultivation world? The secret of the netherworld would also be exposed. We don't have to enter the netherworld. The setup of the netherworld is very delicate. There's something fishy about it. Lu Xiaoyi originally thought that since he had come to the splendid world, he should at least take a look at Shi Zhao and the others. Since he didn't have to enter the netherworld, he could only leave it to fate. However, he was also curious. Was there any connection between the passageway guarded by Shi Zhao and the netherworld? They were all ownerless souls. Could it be that the swordsmen were actually members of the netherworld? Why didn't he hear them mention it? Daoists raised his hand to set up the array. When we were still immortals, this was just a matter of lifting our feet. Now that we can't, there are a lot of trivial matters. Guard C, come and see how to set up this netherworld passage array. If you have time, you can come and play. Lu Xiaoyi was a little speechless. I don't have this hobby. There are no relatives or friends in there to take care of. Old Sin, will the immortal court know if we go in like this? Daoists sneered. If they want to know, they will definitely know. But I'm afraid they don't have the time to take care of this place. If they can't handle the living, who will take care of the dead? Even if they know, I'm afraid they will be happy to see it happen, right? Don't worry, they have always been very open-minded about things that are beneficial to them. As they spoke, the netherworld passage array was formed. It wasn't a complicated transportation array. It was just a little tricky. Some of the node's coordinates could never be guessed. Once the array was formed, the two entered one after the other. The transportation array disappeared, as if they had never been there. This was a place filled with yin qi, filled with ghostly shadows and indistinct screams. Mortals would lose control of their minds when they first arrived at this place, and their physical bodies would not be able to withstand the yin qi of the netherworld. However, for the two of them, who were used to seeing big scenes, it did not matter much to them. Lu Xiaoyi silently checked his body. It was the same as when he first came to the splendid continent. All his abilities were gone and he was sealed tightly. The first time he came here, he was at the first step of the primordial spirit realm. Now, he was at the first step of the yang spirit realm. The difference wasn't too big. But this was the work of golden immortals. There was no room for discussion. Daoists smiled. Not used to it? Just get used to it. The restrictions of golden immortals can't be broken unless the epoch changes. This is another reason why I'm looking for you. Even if a swordsman doesn't have any divine abilities, the sword in his hand isn't too bad. But if it's a law cultivator, he's basically useless and can't help. Lu Xiaoyi asked, what are the levels of the so-called threats here? Daoists smiled. It's not worth mentioning. Under the seal of golden immortals, you and I were suppressed to this extent. You can imagine the abilities of these ghostly creatures. However, the qi of the netherworld still has some nourishing effects on ghosts that have lived for a long time. So, there are some who have incomparable strength and can jump as if they're flying. After all, immortals rely on them to manage too many living souls. They can only be given some abilities in the current environment to do things well. Yes, I'm talking about those ghost officials. In mortal terms, they're the 10 Yama kings and their subordinate. There are too many legends about the netherworld. They're illogical and often contradictory. There's also no standard that's accurate in the universe. So, the Immortal Court omitted some occupations like the Ghost Emperor and Xitigarbha. They just used the 10 Yama Kings system. This is probably the most popular legend. Chapter 2379. Lu Xiaoyi was very serious because, in essence, he was a person who was used to thinking about problems from the perspective of battle. Old Sin, when was the last time you came here? Daoist Sin laughed. This swordsman acted ruthlessly in the origin world, but he was actually a very cautious person. He couldn't be blamed for thinking too much. After all, this was the swordsman's first time here, and he was a complete stranger, unlike Daoist Sin who came here as an immortal. The last time I came here was 2,000 years ago. At that time, I had already been deposed by the Immortal Court. I came here by chance and found something wrong, but I didn't understand the problem of establishing a Tao at that time, so I didn't take it to heart. Don't worry, even though I came here as a half-immortal, I didn't meet any truly troublesome enemies, just a few. Lu Xiaoyi sighed. Old Sin, let's not hold back anymore, okay? If there's really no problem, why did you ask me to come here? You think you have too much merit, so you're looking for someone to share it with? Daoist Sin was a bit embarrassed. The swordsman wasn't knowledgeable, but he wasn't good at fighting. Even the million-year-old Immortal Court rarely fought with others, and even if they did, it was within the Immortal Court's rules. How could it be as vicious as the origin world? Of course, he had his own way of fighting, and it was a very powerful way of fighting. However, that was referring to facing normal opponents in the normal world. In this place, the environment was abnormal, and the sword cultivator was also a freak. Therefore, his little bit of fighting ability was really not enough. We're just here for a stroll, and it won't affect the order of this place, so of course there's no problem. But if we want to change something, we'll affect the interests of these ghost officials. These things rely on their thick skin to adapt to the environment, so they're really hard to deal with. That's why I asked Guardian C to come along, but, Lu Xiaoyi sighed. You're just looking for a fighter? No problem, I don't mind. But since we're already here, Old Sin, you should at least tell us your plan. You can't just blindly go around like this, right? Sin Bai's expression became serious. I was just about to mention it to Guardian C. I came here this time because of the unbearable atmosphere in Duan Su's place. I can't bear to see the arrogance and resentment here, which will affect their future reincarnation. He didn't want to force it either. After being an immortal for so many years, he had at least understood one thing. Force would never solve the problem at its root. Since there hasn't been an immortal to manage this place for so many years, could I take this opportunity to pretend to be an immortal's emissary and guide the operation of the underworld as an immortal and correct some of the habits that have gone astray? You shouldn't underestimate such a change. Although this place only accepts the deaths of 20,000 ordinary people in the universe, which doesn't sound like a lot, the absolute number is still terrifying. Eliminating the negative energy of these souls will have a huge impact on their behavior after reincarnation. After all, these souls weren't ordinary people when they were alive. They were all outstanding talents among the mortals. These ghost officials don't have access to the upper realm, so they don't have any sources of information. I'm also very familiar with the operating habits of the immortals here, so this strategy has a high chance of success. The reason why he called the custodian here was to prepare for any eventualities. If there were any stubborn people who refused to listen to his advice, he would be killed immediately. Of course it's not easy for an immortal's emissary from the upper realm like me to do such a task. It's just right to leave it to you. Lu Xiaoyi smiled bitterly. So you're here to pretend to be an imperial envoy? Old man Sin, I'm afraid you've read too many novels about the mortal world. Since Daoist Sin was an immortal's emissary, Lu Xiaoyi's position was only left with a strong man. As the immortal's emissary's attendant, he had to do odd jobs. Now he also had to do the chauffeur job. This was a very flashy antler carriage. The 4 immortal deers were very handsome, and the carriage was very luxurious. Lu Xiaoyi cracked his whip in the driver's seat and asked, "Why can't I take anything from Splendid Storage Ring the last time I came here, but I can take anything from here?" Taoists chuckled. The restrictions in the real mortal world are a bit stricter. The netherworld is full of ownerless souls, so in order to shock them and proclaim the might of the netherworld, the restrictions are a bit looser. However, the things you can bring out are just for show. They don't have any power, they just look different. This carriage is just for show. It can't fly fast, and it doesn't have any functions. But since I'm a master, I can't just walk here, can I? In the dusky underworld, the deer carriage spiraled down. Gradually, a man-made underworld appeared in front of Lu Xiaoyi's eyes. The entire underworld was like a huge sinkhole. This was to correspond to the 18 layers of hell that mortals imagined. According to Taoists, the underworld was originally shaped like a pagoda. Because it didn't conform to the aesthetics of mortals and didn't fit the gloomy atmosphere, it later became a sinkhole. This was a world surrounded by the yin qi of the netherworld. Only in this environment could the fragile souls of mortals not dissipate. Instead, they could roughly take on the appearance they had when they were alive. They had all kinds of emotions, and the bodies formed by yin qi could feel pain. This was in preparation for punishment. The system is incomplete, contradictory, and lacks logic. This is the underworld that mortals imagined. The golden immortals thought of it quite well at first, but ever since this sinkhole was created, it has been constantly changing in contradiction. Even now, they still haven't figured it out. There are many reasons for this. The immortals who were sent here were purely idling around. None of them really put any thought into this place. The immortal court didn't invest much in this place, and now they're even on the verge of giving it up. Furthermore, the thoughts of ordinary mortals are really unreasonable. How in the world did they manage to put all these random things together? Death, reincarnation, and rebirth. This was originally a very serious process, but they turned it into a farce. It was no wonder that Taoists kept complaining. To strict cultivators, some of the thoughts of ordinary mortals were truly a disaster. They were hopelessly naive. The management system was full of mistakes and contradictions. It was as bloated as the mortal world. The worst thing was that they had no choice but to use strict cultivation methods to reflect this absurdity. This simply made people collapse. It was no wonder that so many immortals came to manage this place, but none of them were willing to take over. To them, this was an insult to cultivation. They yearned for truth, kindness, and beauty, so they came up with the idea of torturing these wicked people in the 18 levels of hell. They wanted them to turn over a new leaf here, and become good people after reincarnation. This is understandable. But the worst thing is that the executors are themselves. Therefore, in the underworld, whether it's the good or the evil, they're all more capable of torturing people than the wicked. Mixed together like this, it's already impossible to distinguish who's good and who's evil. It's also impossible to determine whether they can eliminate their anger after reincarnation, or if they'll become even more paranoid and crazy. The main thing we're going to deal with now is these guys who used to have boundless glory in the world of the living. Now they've already become fat bureaucrats. Their smiles are sweeter than honey, but their methods are incomparably cruel. You have to admit that these guys are full of talent in the punishment of the 18 levels of hell. Chapter 2380. In the sinkhole, apart from the 18 layers of hell, there were also 10 great halls. Taoists ordered, go to King Qingguang's palace. There's a palace bell there that can summon everyone for a meeting. The deer carriage spiraled down. No ghosts cheered, and no souls were afraid. All the souls here were in a state of numbness. No ghost officials came out to welcome them, especially since no immortals had appeared for thousands of years. Naturally, they did not consider the possibility of immortals appearing. Outside King Qingguang's palace hung a huge bell, the death knell. Lu Xiaoyi floated to the front of the bell and picked up the drumstick. His way of moving here was floating, but this floating was not caused by magic. Everything here was floating. It was like walking normally in the mortal world. There was no ground here. For whom does the death knell tolls? Lu Xiaoyi sighed as he raised the drumstick and smashed it down with all his might. This was a very strange journey. The goal was unclear, the method was unreliable, and the targets were not humans. This was a completely unfamiliar system. Not only did it refer to the officials of the netherworld, it also included the power system that he was most concerned about. The dull sound of the death knell reverberated throughout the sinkhole. It was made of special materials and deliberately lowered the frequency of the bell, causing people's hair to stand on end. This was done deliberately by the immortals to create a gloomy atmosphere. Everything was done to destroy the will of the soul. Of course, this might not be the intention of the immortals. Who asked the mortals to think so? Although the sound of the bell was low, it was extremely penetrating. Almost in an instant, countless figures flew out from each of the halls. Those souls who were numb like walking corpses widened their eyes in horror. They could not help but look for a place to lean on, then poked their heads out and anxiously waited for a possible change. They had long been used to it. There was no worst, only worse. The first to arrive was King Qingguang. He was a fat man with a big belly. There was a tumor on the top of his head. His eyebrows were slanted, his eyes were bulging, and his mouth was like a blood basin. His upper body was extremely long and fat, and his lower body had 2 legs. He was dressed in a red robe and looked extremely extravagant, as if he wanted to hang all his belongings on it. Behind him was a group of subordinates. They were tall, short, fat, thin, and had different appearances. However, they all had one thing in common, which was that they were extremely ugly and ferocious. One look and anyone could tell that they were not good people. Upon hearing Lu Xiaoyi's sigh, Daoistsen, who was sitting in the carriage, also felt very helpless. You can't blame the immortal court for having poor taste. Who asked the mortal world to describe the people of the underworld in such a way? All the realms, all the character designs, and all the characters of the netherworld were inseparable from the essence of evil and ugly. They didn't understand what cultivation was, so they simply thought that the good must be handsome, and the bad must be ugly. It took a lot of effort for the first immortal who managed the underworld to find such a large group of repulsive immortals. Later immortals simply couldn't be bothered to look for them. Let's just make do with it. Seeing these ghost officials dilly-dallying not far away, it seemed like they were waiting for everyone to gather before coming over to meet them. It was very strange. There are many subordinates. Did every hall have to be equipped with a bureaucratic system? From what I see, each hall seems to have a judge, Zhong Kuei, black and white impermanence, oxhead, horseface, Mengpe. Daoistsen was actually too lazy to explain, because everything in this place made him speechless. But since Swordsman asked, he had no choice but to waste his breath. According to the understanding of mortals, after a person dies, the black and white impermanence will go and capture the soul. The judge will judge the person, and Oxhead and Horseface will be hired thugs. In the end, the king of hell will convict the person. After being tortured enough, they will be handed over to Mengpe to be fed soup. That's roughly the procedure. But there are actually many loopholes in this. First of all, if the black and white impermanents are relied on to capture people, they will be exhausted to death. If that's the case, the underworld might need thousands of black and white impermanents. It's also impossible for the judge to judge the past of these souls one by one. That would be a terrible debt. Just look at the Yamen of the mortal world, it's clear that they can't afford it. Mengpo, on the other hand, has nothing to do. In fact, she doesn't need to be fed soup at all. because of the mystery of being in the womb, the soul is destined to reincarnate without leaving behind any memories. Even cultivators can't do that, let alone ordinary mortals. That's why it's just spicy soup. It's made according to Meng Po's preferences. She uses whatever ingredients she has on hand. It's purely ritualistic. There are many similar things that everyone is fooling around with, but I don't know who they're fooling. Taoists' complaints were endless. Therefore, the Golden Immortals originally wanted to establish a system similar to the reincarnation of cultivators through the underworld, and at the same time achieve the goal of punishing evil and promoting good. But after so many years, they found that they didn't do anything except establish a corrupt system in the underworld. In fact, it's 100 times darker than the mortal world, because there's no cultivation power to balance it. As Taoists chattered on, the 10 kings of hell finally gathered. The 10 kings of hell, King Qinguang, King Chujiang, King Songdi, King Coroner, King Yanluo, King Pingdeng, King Taishan, King Dushi, King Bianqing, and King Zhuanluan stepped forward in unison. King Qinguang said, "Esteemed immortal, we came late to welcome you. Please forgive us for our negligence." They were looking at the deer carriage. Apart from immortals, no one in the underworld could use such a cultivation artifact, nor could they afford to use it. Taoists' clear voice rang out. "I'm Immortal Official Bei Zong. This time, I've been ordered to come here because the underworld hasn't returned to the order of the Immortal Court for 3,000 years. It has lost control and is extremely chaotic, betraying the virtue of the heavenly Tao. You should gather in Qinguang Hall and prepare for palace affairs. Wait for my instructions." He didn't hold back and went straight to the point. This was also the usual way immortals managed the underworld. With some ghosts, even if they were powerful ghosts, what was there to be polite about? Of course, he was pretending to be an esteemed immortal, but it was precisely because of this that he couldn't be soft-spoken. Otherwise, there were many evil people here, and each of them was old and cunning. If he wasn't careful, he would be seen through. The kings of hell were submissive. They had long been used to this way of getting along with immortals, so they didn't feel that there was anything wrong with it. It was just that they had lost their dignity. In this place, losing face in front of immortals wasn't a problem. As long as they could maintain their status, everything else didn't matter. In their opinion, every time an immortal came down, it was basically the same thing. They would first use big words to suppress you, then pretend to flip through the files. What could they really find? As long as everyone behaved respectfully, had a sincere attitude, and knew that they would correct their mistakes, they would at least be perfunctory for a while. This was their experience. They had been doing procedures for tens of thousands of years, so it wasn't a big deal. These ghost officials lined up in 2 rows respectfully. God knows where they got a red carpet from. There was the sound of music, and there were many ceremonial guards. It was as if they had done everything a human emperor would do. This was probably the most ceremonious ceremony they could think of. But there was nothing they could do about it. Who asked them to not be cultivators? Chapter 2381. After a set of solemn procedures, Taoists finally got off the deer carriage and arrived at Qinguang's main hall, escorted by a group of ghost officials. He sat down on the main seat, with a servant standing beside him. The ghost officials below him kowtowed, just like a court in the mortal world. It was quite realistic. Lu Xiaoyi hugged the golden sword breaker and tried his best to act like the legendary strongman, even though he had never seen a real strongman of the immortal court. The golden sword breaker was given to him by Taoists and was also an immortal artifact. Its material wasn't bad, but it was a bit heavy. With his current sealed body, it might not be easy for him to use it as a sword. From the beginning to the end, Taoists hadn't revealed to him how he planned to reform the netherworld. He also didn't ask because it involved the division of merits in the future. If he came up with an idea, How would the debt be settled in the end? Would he steal the limelight? Although the two of them had a good relationship now, it wasn't to the point where they could respectfully give up their merit. Lu Xiaoyi had already gained a big advantage in the collision of the 5 rings. Now it was Daoist's turn. This was the tacit understanding between cultivators. However, he wasn't optimistic about Daoist's trip to the netherworld. Although it was his first time here, the oppressive and gloomy atmosphere made him very uncomfortable. Although this was how the netherworld should be in the eyes of mortals, that was only the way of thinking of mortals. How could he expect this kind of atmosphere to eliminate the resentment? He was afraid that it would only increase the resentment. In his opinion, this wasn't something that could be completely solved by changing the system. Moreover, the system would also change. Without an immortal watching over this place, it would return to its original state as soon as you left. However, he couldn't say anything right now. This time, Daoistsen was in charge. He was a strong man. What was a strong man? It meant that he only used his strength and didn't use his brain. Daoistsen pretended to flip through the files, but it was actually meaningless. For thousands of years, countless mortals had reincarnated here. There were no traces of their previous lives and no traces of their afterlives. Their experiences in the netherworld were even worse. Wasn't it easy to write down what they wanted? However, this was a necessary foreplay. Even an egg had to be picked out to have a bone. There was only one purpose: to beat them. After knocking on the doors for several hours, not a single one of the officials of hell showed any signs of impatience. He listened very seriously and reflected on himself from time to time. There was even a special scribe who was writing rapidly, afraid that he would miss a single word. Lu Xiaoyi saw this and couldn't help but sigh again. This kind of behavior could only mean two things. Either they were sincerely trying to turn over a new leaf, or they were just a bunch of sly old officials trying to fool their superiors. What kind of meat do you think these old cats that have been serving for tens of thousands of years will be? Lu Xiaoyi didn't remind him. To an immortal who had lived for 1,000,000 years, reminding him was an insult. Daoistsen nodded in satisfaction. Regardless of whether he was really satisfied or not, he had to pretend to be satisfied, especially when he was still a fake. I have 10 plans for reforming hell. Today I'll pass them down. You all should act according to them. I believe it won't be long before we can restore hell to its former glory. Daoistsen's dignified gaze swept across the ghost. He saw a series of uneasiness and disdain in his heart. Sure enough, they're showing their true colors now that they're serious. However, this couldn't stop his determination. He had been preparing for this for many years. First, Hell's ghost officials have a fixed rank every 100 years. Those who are capable will be promoted, and those who are mediocre will be demoted. Everyone can be the king of Hell of the 10 palaces. No one is allowed to sit in their positions without doing anything, and no one is allowed to bully others. Second, establish a system of mutual supervision and reporting, and resolutely crack down on those who act to satisfy their own selfish desires. Third, the 18 layers of hell are too cruel. There's a risk of overcorrection. We need to be more differentiated and humane. Daoistsen rambled on and on, while Lu Xiaoyi began to slowly relax his muscles and bones. He stretched his arms and legs, preparing to kill. This kind of method wasn't to change, but to cause trouble. Sure enough, before Daoistsen could finish speaking, the ghost officials below all revealed their ferocious eyes. That bit of respect and docility was gone, and they began to reveal their true colors. King Qingguang stood up and questioned loudly, "Exalted Immortal, are you not letting your subordinates have an easy time? Every one of us here has served the immortal court for at least tens of thousands of years, and some have even served for more than 100,000 years. Especially us, the kings of hell, we grew up together with hell. Even if we didn't make any contributions, we've still worked hard. Just because of Exalted Immortal's words, everything we've done has gone down the drain? The heavenly Tao is unfair. It treats souls like straw dogs. Please forgive us for not being able to accept such an order to get rid of the donkey after it has outlived its usefulness. He wasn't the only one. The other 9 kings of hell behind him, as well as their subordinates, all began to get agitated. Their momentum was so great that it was as if they wanted to tear off the roof of Qingguang Hall. Daoist Sin, on the other hand, was very calm. He acted like a true immortal, fearless in the knowledge that he had backing. The rules of hell are set by the immortal court, not you. What, do you really think you're the master of this place after acting like a tyrant for tens of thousands of years? If the immortal court can give it to you, it can naturally take it back. If you keep blabbering, I'm afraid you won't even be able to keep your souls intact. After all, Daoist Sin had some understanding of this place. He knew that he couldn't be soft in front of these wily old foxes. If he were to be soft, he could forget about succeeding in his reforms in the future. A ghost king stepped forward. It was none other than King Yanluo. Exalted Immortal is right. Everything we have is given to us by the immortal court. Otherwise, who knows how many reincarnations we've reincarnated and suffered. We thank the immortal court and respect it. Even if the immortal court wants us to die right now and reincarnate to become cattle or horses, we'll have no objections. But, Exalted Immortal, can you really represent the immortal court? Daoist Sin knew that things weren't going well, so he forced himself to remain calm. What? Are you trying to rebel? Are you going to be thrown into the 18 levels of hell you've set for yourselves and never be reincarnated? Back down, otherwise don't blame me for being ruthless. Ghostly wails and howls. All the ghost officials in Qingguang Hall laughed wildly. In the midst of their laughter, each of them took out their own weapons. The judge's brush, the morning staff of the black and white impermanence, the steel fork of Oxhead and Horseface, and the chains of the ghost soldiers below. King Chakravarti swung his halberd. How dare you? Do you really think that our hell is ignorant and can't differentiate between the real and the fake? Do you think that any random person who comes down here can pretend to be a deity? We originally respected your ability. Since you're able to come down to hell, you must be a cultivator of the mortal world. In line with the principle of having nothing to do with each other, we shouldn't go too far. We should just pretend that we didn't know anything and fulfill your wishes. But I didn't expect that you 2 dogheads are insatiable. You actually want to interfere with the operation of hell and take away everyone's livelihood. If this can be tolerated, what else can we tolerate? Since that's the case, let's have a fight. We'd like to see how capable a cultivator of the mortal world is after coming to hell. Chapter 2382. The ghost officials surged forward, vowing to kill these 2 daring bastards. Lu Xiaoyi took a step forward and swung his golden truncheon down, colliding with the pitchfork of one of the ox-headed officials. He only felt a strong surge of brute force. Even though he had experienced hundreds of battles, he still found it hard to resist. However, he was still experienced and didn't use brute force. The golden truncheon spun and sealed the pitchfork outside. He raised his leg and kicked the ox-headed official, sending him flying and crashing heavily into the palace wall. He didn't seem to be hurt. He shook his head and stood up again. An ominous glint flashed in his eyes, and he pounced forward again with his pitchfork. Lu Xiaoyi's heart sank. He knew he was in trouble. In a special place like the Netherworld, where his abilities were sealed, the gap between him and these ghost officials wasn't as big as he imagined. Of course, this had a lot to do with the fact that he wasn't holding a real sword. In theory, whether or not he was holding a sword shouldn't have any effect on him. However, the problem was that the quality of this golden truncheon was too good. It was a bit too heavy. It was so heavy that his sealed body couldn't handle it very well. The golden truncheon wasn't the best weapon for these ghost bodies in the Netherworld. Everything was abnormal. If the golden truncheon could retain its original properties, it wouldn't even need to be wielded against the ghost body. Just the layer of light from the truncheon would be enough to make the ghost body vanish into thin air. But now it was just a slightly heavier metal truncheon. The Golden Immortal's restrictions weren't only for people, but also for objects. The ox-headed official was already so difficult to deal with. There were at least hundreds of ghost officials here who were similar to the ox-headed official. Among them, there were many whose positions were higher than the ox-headed official and the horse-faced official. The golden truncheon flipped, sending a few ghost officials flying. His judgment was very clear. He shouted at Daoistson, "If you don't leave now, you can only stay here as a ghost for the rest of your life." He didn't care whether Daoistson would listen to him or not. He jumped onto the deer carriage, shook the reins and ran. He felt the carriage sink. It was definitely Daoistson, but it couldn't be the Reapers because they didn't have any weight. The deer carriage wasn't fast, especially for someone like Lu Xiaoyi. It was as slow as a snail. However, speed was relative. It was better to be faster than the Reapers. He waved the golden mace and swept away the obstacles in front of him. Firstly, his ability was indeed impressive. Secondly, it seemed that the Reapers were not using their full strength. When the deer carriage started moving, the ghostly wails behind them slowly stopped and gradually faded away. They began to go in circles in the huge underworld of the underworld. Daoistson was very dissatisfied. "Bailey, you're not very good at being a strong man." He actually ran faster than the main character. Moreover, I didn't think that the famous #1 sword of the Origin world would be so battered and exhausted when dealing with these weaklings. Lu Xiaoyi smiled faintly. "I did run a little fast, I admit. But Old Sin, you didn't say anything first. The moment you came up, you had the intention to destroy the entire Ghost Envoy residence. Isn't this too unkind? It's fine if you don't greet me, but you're also ridiculously wrong about the strength of the ghost servants here. Tell me, how do you explain this?" Daoistson was rendered speechless. The sword cultivator saw through his intentions with a single glance. His so-called terms were proper overbearing terms. They were not for negotiation at all, but to find a way to destroy the sect. How could he not know that there was no room for negotiation? Therefore, he could only find an excuse to let the Reapers make the first move. Then, he and the swordsman would take the opportunity to exterminate these arrogant Reapers. The only way to solve this problem was to establish a new bureaucratic system in the underworld. He didn't say this out loud because he was worried that the swordsman wouldn't be willing to kill him. This was a plan that he had thought of long ago. If he found too many people, he would get a share of his merit. Therefore, it was best to find someone who could solve this problem alone. But now, it seemed that the strength of these Reapers was completely different from the last time he came to the underworld. After 3 days of separation, he had to look at them with new eyes. He scratched his head. I wonder what happened? These things in the underworld seem to be a lot stronger than before. The worst thing is that they seem to have become smarter? They were able to tell that my identity was fake with a single glance. This definitely wasn't a problem with their eyesight. Someone must have been reporting to them about the situation outside, including the immortal court's indifferent attitude towards the underworld. This isn't easy to handle. Knowing that the underworld will change in the future, how can we make them abide by the rules? Lu Xiaoyi didn't say anything. He only focused on controlling the deer carriage. Since Daoistson didn't get a response, he could only talk to himself. There's a limit to the number of times we can enter the underworld. The teleportation ability of the Netherworld portal is limited, and we can't bring too many people in. The problem now is that we can't intimidate them in terms of strength. In terms of planning, it's hard for us to come up with a perfect plan. I'm afraid that this trip to the underworld is a bit reckless. Lu Xiaoyi said indifferently. It's you, not us. Daoistson smiled bitterly. I didn't tell you in advance because I thought that it would be an easy task. Who knew that these things' strength would increase by leaps and bounds after a few thousand years? Could it be that the changes in the universe before the end of the era have affected this place? Or is there someone behind this? If someone is doing this on purpose, what's their goal? Seeing that Lu Xiaoyi was still hanging high in the air, Daoistsen couldn't help but ask him, Inspector, if you change to a sword, how many of these ghost envoys can you deal with? Lu Xiaoyi didn't bother with him. He answered seriously, I can slaughter all of them within 100. I can't control them outside of 100. Daoistsen was somewhat moved. If he were to join in, he could deal with 20 or 30 ghost envoys without a problem. Then, if he were to divide the ghost envoys into groups, it wouldn't be impossible for him to succeed. However, he also knew that this was already a bit beyond the main point of the two of them working together. If in the end the swordsman still took the lion's share of the merit, he would be a bit unwilling. This swordsman was very strange. No matter who it was, as long as they cooperated with him, he would take away the majority of the benefits in the end. Moreover, he would be the one in charge of the process. No matter how much he thought about it, he couldn't think of a better way. No matter how the swordsman divided the merit, it would still be less than pulling in a group of people. There was no good way to choose the lesser of two evils. In this world where the fist was the most powerful, this was a law that couldn't be changed even in the underworld. Inspector, you're not saying anything. Are you blaming me for not telling you in advance and wanting to take all the credit for yourself? Lu Xiaoyi sighed. Oldson, our cooperation has a master and a subordinate. In the fifth ring, I was the master and you were the subordinate. Now, in the underworld, you should be the master and I should be the subordinate. This is the way to cooperate. What do you want me to say? If what I say doesn't make sense, then it's the same as not saying anything. If what I say makes sense and you accept it, then it will share your merit. It's because I understand this principle and for the sake of our future cooperation that I can't say anything. Chapter 2383. Daoistsen was speechless. Swordsman's words were very clear. Either everyone would depend on their own abilities to see how much merit they contributed, or Daoistsen would be the main character and swordsman would only be a supporting character. The problem was that he couldn't bear the responsibility of being the main character. This was the crux of the problem. He was also a decisive person, so he made up his mind after a slight hesitation. Things had already come to this point, so it was impossible for him to take the majority of the merit for himself. This wasn't a matter of whether he wanted to or not, but a matter of his own ability. Fine. I've stayed in the immortal court for too long, so I don't know how to deal with the ghosts of the mortal world. All these years, I've been mingling in the cultivation world of the origin world, thinking about how to establish my Tao, but I don't have the true state of mind of a mortal cultivator. How about this? You can say whatever you want, and I'll be the one in the end. As for how to distribute the merit after this, I'll leave it to heaven's will. What do you think? Lu Xiaoyi smiled. He really didn't want to fight for anything. With the great karma of the Heaven's Choice continent in the future, why would he care about this little bit of merit? However, Daoistsen was an immortal, so he couldn't compare to him in certain aspects. For example, his insight, his familiarity with the history of cultivation, and the use of various techniques. An immortal's insight was on a completely different level from his. However, Daoistsen was unlucky. He placed himself in such a special environment, so all his strengths were useless. On the contrary, his ability to mingle in the mortal world was more important here. But Daoistsen had never experienced this in the immortal court. After being banished to the lower realm, he was busy trying to crawl back to the immortal court, so how could he travel in the mortal world again? Therefore, his plan seemed to be an armchair strategist and unrealistic. I have a question. Can the two of us really kill those ghost envoys in the underworld? Daoistsen was startled, but he immediately understood. However, he still refused to admit it. So we can kill them. Lu Xiaoyi didn't show any mercy. You were an immortal before, but not anymore. Let's not talk about how awesome you were in the past, okay? Neither of us can do it now. It's not a matter of strength, but a matter of rules. I've already tried it in the battle just now. I can temporarily destroy them, but they will immediately revive in the underworld because they belong here. This is their resurrection pool. Not only the ghost officers and ghost envoys, but also those weak ownerless souls. Even if they were so weak that a fart could destroy them, we still wouldn't be able to kill them. You have the experience of an immortal, so you can judge for yourself whether I'm right or not. Daoistsen couldn't help but admit that the swordsman's words made a lot of sense. In terms of combat intuition, he was far inferior to the swordsman. Of course, this was also why he had insisted on bringing him along. If they couldn't kill him, it meant that their massacre was useless and meaningless. Daoistsen suddenly realized that his so-called plan had fallen into a dead end. Once this swordsman opened his mouth, countless verbal cannons would come pouring in. Oldson, how did you make the plan? We don't know the enemy's situation, we don't know the reason, and we don't know the principles. After thousands of years we came up with such a stupid idea? This idea must have been learned from a novel, right? Do you dare to believe the words of those wretched literati? You're lucky you met me. If it were anyone else, you might not even be able to leave the underworld alive. Daoistsen's embarrassment turned into anger. What do you mean by thousands of years of planning? I've been working on my great Tao for thousands of years. Recently, I've succeeded in my great Tao. Only then did I remember that I should work on my merit. Only then did I remember about the 5 rings and the underworld. Lu Xiaoyi suddenly understood. So you're just cramming at the last minute. You don't usually burn incense. If I'd known your plan was like this, I wouldn't have come with you to waste time. If I had the time, wouldn't it have been better for me to spend it in the sword Dao steel? Daoistsen felt like he had nothing left to lose. Stop being so eccentric. You came here because you thought you could take advantage of it, didn't you? Do you really think you're a saint? Now that I've split the initiative, you're still not satisfied? What's with all this nonsense? Do you have a plan or not? If not, we'll all go home. You didn't help us this time. Lu Xiaoyi laughed heartily. See, I said what's on my mind after being provoked? Forget it, we're all acquaintances, so I won't go too far. I'll say the ugly words first. Once I come up with this idea, I'm afraid we won't be able to split the merits evenly. I'm afraid I'll take the lion's share. I, Lu Xiaoyi, am an honest man who doesn't do underhanded things. I'll tell you the result first. I'm not trying to take advantage of you. Oldson, if you think the merits here are important to you, then there's no need to rush to solve this matter. You can think about it slowly after we leave. Or you can find a companion who won't steal your merits. I won't say anything either way. Who told me, escort Lu, to be known throughout the world? Daoistsen was really in a difficult position. He really needed to make some contributions in order to offset the bad impression he had of the heavenly Tao due to disobeying the immortal court's orders. Therefore, he really didn't want to give this guy too much of his merit. However, even if he couldn't think of a solution now, could he think of one after he left? It was best to cut the Gordian knot when it came to matters like this. The longer he delayed, the easier it would be for something unforeseen to happen. Especially before the end of the era, when the universe was changing faster and faster. Who knew what kind of demons would appear in the underworld in a few more decades? Find a companion? Perhaps it wouldn't be as big of a threat as this swordsman, but what if it was a piece of trash? If he couldn't do it, what was the point of talking about splitting the merits? He looked at Lu Xiaoyi with a burning gaze. You said that you still have a big matter that can obtain the will of the heavens? If you promise me that you won't drag me down with you, then I'll leave the matter of the underworld to you." Lu Xiaoyi laughed inwardly. It was really hard for this has been immortal. In order to climb back up, he had to work so hard that it made one's heart ache. Unfortunately, his misfortune was that he met Lu Xiaoyi. Alright, Old Sin, you were once an immortal. How can you be so petty? I promise you that when we're done with this matter, I won't forget about you for the next big matter. So, have you made your decision? Daoistsen didn't know how he was forced to this point. When Yi Zhantian saw this swordsman, he felt that it wouldn't be hard to deal with him based on his past experience. However, when he really came into contact with him, he realized that he was a true demon that couldn't be touched. It was a pity that he understood it a little too late. Just say it. I, Beizong Immortal Lord, was a famous person in the Immortal Court. Don't tell me that I would go back on my word. Furthermore, this matter is left to the Heavenly Tao to decide. No one can control it. Lu Xiaoyi smiled and nodded. We indeed can't kill those ghost officials and ghost envoys. But even if we can't kill them, there are some here that can be killed. For example, those ownerless souls that have been oppressed for a long time? Chapter 2384. Daoistsen's eyes lit up. After all, he wasn't stupid. How could anyone who could become an immortal be a fool? I understand now. Bewitch those soulless souls at the bottom to rebel. They're all souls, so if they have a grudge against each other, they can devour each other. One soul, one mouth. With us keeping them in check, it shouldn't be too difficult. We can also find those who are willing to listen to us and let them take the position. It's really killing two birds with one stone, killing two birds with one stone. Brilliant, it's really brilliant. Lu Xiaoyi couldn't help but pour cold water on him. Old Sin, don't think about it too simply. Instigating a rebellion isn't a simple matter. Especially when submitting to adversity has become a habit. It requires a lot of time, and you also need to find the right target. In addition, how to devour the foundation of the bureaucracy step by step is also a very difficult tactical problem. Finally, I don't object to your idea of finding a spokesperson among those who came later. We can't stay here forever, so we'll have to find a spokesperson eventually. But that's even more difficult. To the human heart, even if he performed well during the rebellion, what would happen if he were to sit in that position is a completely different matter. It's not that simple. Daoistsen quickly calculated in his mind. To tell the truth, he originally thought that swordsman's idea might not be that good, so he decided to drag it out first. But who knew that Lu Xiaoyi would immediately block his path of retreat? He immediately realized that this might be the best way, and also the only way. Compared to immortals like them, those who had experienced life in the mortal world were indeed different. How will we choose the next leader of hell? That's still a long way off, so let's not think about it for now. Let's do what we can do first. How about this, Inspector C? Don't blame me for taking the credit. Let's divide the work between us. I'll be in charge of instigating the gathering, and you'll be in charge of the specific tactical arrangements. Once we've gotten rid of these people, we'll discuss the future of hell in detail. What do you think? Lu Xiaoyi nodded with a smile. He was well aware of the reason behind Daoistsen's suggestion. Daoistsen wanted to accomplish certain things independently, not under his guidance. This was a cultivator's persistence and pride, so he should understand and not fuss over minor matters. In fact, he didn't mind letting Daoistsen do whatever he wanted, but he still believed in himself more when it came to fighting. When it came to battles and his life was at stake, he would not listen to anyone's advice. This was a quality that an outstanding swordsman must have. Now that the plan had been decided, they went their separate ways. Daoistsen began to approach the ownerless souls who had been oppressed. Lu Xiaoyi was too lazy to ask him what methods he had up his sleeves. Presumably, his experience as an immortal and his multiple visits to the underworld would give him some experience. Lu Xiaoyi's target was none other than the ghost officers of the 10 Kings of Hell. The exact number of people in each palace? Distribution? Their stress response to provocation? Desire for battle? And their fighting ability. In the underworld, because these ghost officers had been managing the souls for a long time, they had formed a deep connection with the underworld's yin energy. Over a long period of time, they had gradually transformed this connection into strength. This was why they were so strong and completely different from other souls. For the majority of souls, they wouldn't stay in the underworld for long. Otherwise, the underworld would be overcrowded sooner or later. The number of living souls that entered the underworld would have to be reincarnated in order to maintain a certain balance. If they couldn't stay in the underworld for long, they wouldn't be able to enjoy the opportunity to strengthen their soul for too long. The dense underworld yin energy in the underworld wouldn't be able to nourish them to the point where they could challenge the ghost officers and ghost officers. Those who were slightly stronger would be consciously sent away by the 10 Kings of Hell for the sake of their stability. Of course, this was also the reason why the Immortals had designed this system in the beginning. They had to have a certain level of ability for the managers. Otherwise, how could they manage those rebellious souls? It was both simple and difficult to understand all of this. The difficult part was that most of the living souls didn't know anything. Some really didn't know anything, while others didn't dare to say anything. The simple part was that the number of living souls managed here was more than 100 million. There were only less than 1,000 ghost officers and ghost officers. On average, there might only be one manager in the tens of thousands of living souls. This was a huge loophole. The ghost officers couldn't even recognize all the living souls under them. This was because most of their energy was focused on the 18 levels of hell. In addition, some old men didn't work. This made it possible for two people to infiltrate. There would always be those who had rebellious thoughts. Originally, it was a matter of divine sense, but now, it had returned to the most primitive state of investigation. This was very troublesome, but Lu Xiaoyi enjoyed it. He suddenly realized the meaning of doing these things in the underworld. Theory, practice. Therefore, among the 3 newly created subversive great Daos, the reason why he was the most familiar with devouring was because of his experience in the cave. By the same logic, no matter how deep his understanding of reincarnation was, no matter how many hints he received from Hong Mao, to a great Tao that emphasized system construction, practical experience was extremely important. What was written on paper was ultimately shallow. How could something that hadn't been proven through practice be able to overtake the old order and rise to the top of the innate great Tao that had been operating normally for millions of years? Reincarnation, this kind of experience was very difficult to put into practice. To an individual cultivator, it was impossible to find the most correct answer through reincarnation. In the normal course of the universe, this should be something that was completed through generations of relays. But now, he could only compress this process into a short 1 to 2,000 years. The underworld was the best place to experiment with his new great Tao of reincarnation. With this understanding, Lu Xiaoyi was filled with enthusiasm. He once again realized how naive he was to pin his hopes on others to complete these 3 great Taos. It could only be used as a smokescreen. No one had the foundation that he had in the 3 subversive great Taos. Firstly, it was the deep accumulation of virtue. Secondly, it was his unique practical experience. During this process, he also discovered the chronic and irreversible problems of the underworld's bureaucratic system. These living souls were all mortals, and they did not have the same level of cognition as cultivators. Therefore, all of their thinking started from the mortal world, and all aspects were filled with the influence of the mortal world's imperial court. How long could a mortal government last? Without the support of the cultivators, it wouldn't last more than 1,000 years. It would inevitably slide from the peak of the new dynasty to the decline. This was the chronic problem of the current dynasty system. It was an internal objective law that no one could change. If the mortal dynasty was like this, then there was no need to mention the underworld. This place had been operating for hundreds of thousands of years. One could imagine how broken the system was. All the problems of the mortal dynasty's end were present here. There were also countless problems that were unique to this place. The underworld still existed only because the environment here didn't seem to need to consider the problems of the people's livelihood. They didn't have to worry about food and clothing. In addition, as time passed, the Reaper's individual strength became stronger and stronger. Just from the system alone, it was already riddled with holes. All it lacked was a suitable opportunity. Chapter 2385. In this system, the most fatal thing was their outdated and inflexible ideas, which made them have no sense of crisis at all. Even though Taoists' actions had crossed their bottom line, they didn't realize the destruction these two humans could bring because they believed that the immortal court would make the final decision. In their eyes, they were just two arrogant human cultivators. Did they think they could save the world just because they learned some skills? Childish. This gave Lu Xiaoyi an opportunity to plan his tactic. A month later, the two met sneakily. Taoistsen was a bit tired. He felt that this was even more tiring than studying the Great Tao. With this kind of body and this kind of strength, his lips were about to blister. Most importantly, the people he was persuading weren't normal. I can gather about 10,000 souls now. The more time passes, the more souls I'll gather. But I can't guarantee that they won't spill the beans. There are traitors everywhere in this damned place. I feel like I won't be able to wrap up the fire if I drag this out. Lu Xiaoyi laughed. That's normal. Snitching is also a way to change the state of life. It's simple, easy, and doesn't take any risk. If I were a soul, I would have already sued you for inciting rebellion and conspiring against the law. Taoists shouted, "Stop making sarcastic remarks here. Do you have any confidence if we act now?" Lu Xiaoyi said indifferently, "I don't have confidence. But that's not a reason to not act. 10,000 souls isn't a small number. The key is to form a momentum. Once the momentum is formed, the snowball will roll bigger and bigger, and gathering souls will be easy." Taoistsen nodded. This guy didn't pull his crotch. I think so too. Words alone are useless. It's better to act. We'll set up a banner and build momentum. That's what we do. Have you decided where to start? Lu Xiaoyi pointed into the distance. The reincarnation hall. It's the closest to the world of the living and the furthest from the other halls. Taoistsen glared. Don't tell me we're just going to push from one hall to the next? If it's that simple, can't we have an ingenious tactical arrangement? Lu Xiaoyi sneered. Oldson, you've read too many books. The simplest method was also the most effective. Moreover, do you think that to these living souls, the so-called battle tactics have any meaning? My method may seem clumsy, but there's nothing wrong with the core idea. Ants can kill an elephant if there are enough of them. That's the human wave tactic. It's a swarm of bees. The battle would begin with a few of the lowest-ranked emissaries of hell. They didn't have the 10,000 souls that Taoistsen had bragged about. There were only 1,000 or 2,000 of them. Taoistsen didn't blush in the slightest because of his bragging. In war, wasn't it normal for 1,000 people to be called an army of 10,000? It was already very kind of him not to mention the 100,000 troops. If it were 200 years ago, this place would be filled with the top evildoers and good people. It would be easy to instigate them. But it's different now. Those unruly evildoers and good people have all reincarnated. Now everyone here is basically an ordinary person. So, after the collapse of the 5 fates and 5 virtues, the great Tao of reincarnation no longer had a basis to rely on. Unable to see the light of virtue above the living souls' heads, the great Tao of reincarnation became blind. So now, for the past 200 years, ordinary people were used to make up the numbers. The immortal court also let this go. They couldn't even take care of themselves, so who would worry about these departed souls? Lu Xiaoyi's view was the exact opposite of his. I think this is the best. What you care about is how to fight, but what I care about is how to build the underworld in the future. Ordinary people are good. They're much easier to manage than those so-called good and evil people. Moreover, don't worry. When it comes to a real battle, ordinary people with simple minds are much stronger than those scheming evildoers, and good people. Surrounded by so many living souls, the emissaries of hell weren't worried at all. With their own strength, these weak souls couldn't do anything to them at all. But they didn't know that there were two evil wolves hiding among these flocks of sheep. The living souls dilly-dallied there, overcautious and overcautious. They were very clear about the outcome if they failed. They would be thrown into the 18 levels of hell for the next 100 years and experience those inhuman torment. Although they wouldn't die, the pain wouldn't be any less. It was an enormous torment to the mind. The ones who started the fight could only be the two instigators. Lu Xiaoyi pulled out his long sword, while Taoist Sun used a magic sword. The two of them chopped up the emissaries of hell like they were chopping vegetables. They were really hovering between life and death, because souls like them simply couldn't die in an environment like the underworld. This was the rule set by the Golden Immortal when he established this place. It was the rule of the underworld. You could torture them, but you couldn't kill them. Dying was easy, but to live, there was a process. This slow recovery process was the opportunity for the living souls to take a bite. In the beginning, no one dared to approach, but then a few daring souls surrounded and bit them. What they bit off was the yin qi that these emissaries of hell had accumulated over tens of thousands of years. With the beginning, what followed was very simple. When 1,000 or 2,000 living souls started to bite, the emissaries of hell hadn't been able to hover between life and death a few times before they were bitten until the yin qi they had accumulated over tens of thousands of years was completely gone. They truly returned to the state of primitive living souls when they first entered this place. At this time, the other living souls could no longer bite off anything from their bodies. The emissaries of hell didn't die, because this was the rule, but they also lost the capital to do evil, because the ability that they had painstakingly accumulated over tens of thousands of years was no longer there. The living souls who had tasted the sweetness were somewhat excited, because they felt that their own strength had increased. In this place, increasing one's strength meant that one wouldn't be bullied, or even bullied others. The team had increased by another 1,000. It was a bit of a scale. Taoist Sun was very satisfied. This was a pretty good start. Find a few more emissaries of hell, 10 or so will do. After a few more times, the team will expand like a snowball. Lu Xiaoyi spread out his hands. You wish. How can there be so many lone emissaries for you to slowly grow stronger? They are emissaries of hell, not idiots. Let's directly go to the reincarnation hall. We'll work a little harder. A hall with 100 or so emissaries of hell. We should be able to take them down, right? The team was majestic, but the living souls' morale wasn't high. After all, ever since they had been pulled into the netherworld, they had viewed this kind of king of hell's palace as a taboo. The huge psychological shadow wasn't so easy to erase. Taoist Sun complained, many will die. Although they won't die in the end, but this morale, Lu Xiaoyi didn't hesitate at all. War is to get rid of the weeds and preserve the pure. Only in this kind of life and death situation can you pick out the seeds to manage the netherworld in the future. And we have to be fast. We can't stop, we can't wait for the other king of hell's palaces to react and gather all the emissaries of hell's palace. The two of us won't be able to hold them off. So, once the battle starts, unless the victor is decided, we can't stop. Chapter 2386. The reincarnation hall was filled with the cries of ghosts and shrieks of souls. Lu Xiaoyi and Daoistsen stood at the top of the hall. Below them were the living souls cheering in joy. Over 10,000 had already gathered here, and there were still countless more rushing in from outside the hall. The destruction of a hall had given the large number of living souls a way out. Rebellion was the ultimate dream in everyone's heart. If they couldn't do it while they were alive, it wasn't bad to do it once in death. It was simpler than Daoistsen had imagined. It's actually that easy? Lu Xiaoyi shrugged. As long as we find the right method, it's originally very easy. Next, we just need to sneak into the crowd of living souls and launch sneak attack. We don't need to do too much. With the numbers, everything will be natural. The way the netherworld exists is the most prone to a gathering of souls, but the system of the underworld completely didn't consider this aspect of dealing with it. Of course, external factors are the most important. If it weren't for us, those living souls wouldn't have been able to bite those ghost envoys. He pointed at a certain place. What's up with those ghost envoys over there? In a corner of the reincarnation hall, there were a few ghost envoys looking at the chaotic scene in front of them as if nothing had happened. What was strange was that a large number of living souls passed by them, but none of them were able to harm them. Even Lu Xiaoyi seemed to have killed them a few times? But why were these ghost envoys still so strong after being killed? Just now, there were too many living souls and the scene was too chaotic to see clearly. But now that the situation was settled, it highlighted that these ghost envoys were different from the rest. Daoistsen explained, one of the reasons why living souls can swallow the power of ghost envoys is because we need to kill them, so that they will be in a weakened state when they are reborn. But there's another very important point, and that is that the living souls have been wronged by them. They have been tortured by these ghost envoys in the 18 layers of hell. This is actually the source of the living soul's power. The reason why these ghost envoys are still fine is that they don't have karma towards these ordinary living souls and have never mistreated them. Lu Xiaoyi suddenly understood. We came without any warning. If they can still avoid karma like this, then the self-restraint of these ghost envoys must be very impressive. To be able to persist for tens of thousands of years and still be able to do this, even saints can't do it, right? But what I'm curious about is how the decadent system of hell could possibly tolerate an anomaly like them. Daoistsen smiled. Indeed, it's intolerable. But if they're fair enough, if they can judge things based on their past lives instead of their own likes and dislikes, then they won't be affected by karma even if they torture them in the same way. In other words, not only did they have the perseverance, they also had the ability. They are all the worst evildoers and the greatest good people. Many of these people are capable. You have to admit that. Of course, Lu Xiaoyi admitted it. However, he had a second question. The Chakravarti king is missing. Where did he go? Daoistsen snorted. We have a division of labor, okay? I'll be in charge of agitation, and you'll be in charge of tactics. Now that we've defeated the enemy and the commander has disappeared, you're asking me? Lu Xiaoyi couldn't be bothered to argue with him. Raise the troops and move out. The loss of a major target was an anomaly for him. From the previous few battles, he could clearly feel that the strength of these ghost officials was proportional to their status. For example, Oxhead and Horseface were much higher than ordinary ghost officials. The black and white impermanents were also much higher than Oxhead and Horseface. Judges were obviously much higher than the black and white impermanent. Then, what kind of strength would the Yama kings of the 10 palaces be? He had encountered the judge of the Chakravarti palace before. He was a very powerful expert. He was already very surprised that he couldn't even take down the judge of the Chakravarti king. However, when he thought about how the other party had been playing with the judge's pen for at least tens of thousands of years, it didn't seem impossible. If status was really proportional to strength, then he had to be careful of 10 Yama kings gathered together. Therefore, he had to speed up. Once the curtains were drawn, he couldn't stop. Hoping that these living souls would have any kind of conviction was tantamount to a fool's dream. This was a one-time deal. If it failed, it would take him decades to recover. How could he have so much time to waste here? The next target was the Hall of Equality. There was no need for tactics. Tens of thousands of living souls surged over and instantly surrounded the Hall of Equality. In terms of strength, these living souls weren't worth mentioning. The weakest little ghost officials in the Hall of Equality could beat them up with a wave of their hand. However, there was a limit to the number of ghost officials. Amidst the flying living souls, the two wretched humans mixed in with them. Then, the ghost officials who had begun to reform their souls howled miserably amidst the endless biting. The power that they had painstakingly accumulated over hundreds, thousands, or even tens of thousands of years was eaten up by the living souls. This was their fighting style. Entanglement, densely packed without end. Then, they would wait for the two humans to succeed in their sneak attack. Of course, they still didn't know the true identity of these two humans. They thought that they were two of their kind who had awakened on their own and were exceptionally powerful. The living souls served them as their masters. However, they didn't consider what new harsh laws awaited them after they overthrew the system of the underworld. Let's have a good time first. This was the strength of a group. Any rules and laws weren't worth mentioning in front of such numbers. The law doesn't punish the masses. This wasn't a lie. In the mortal world, this kind of tactic wouldn't be possible. This was because you had to consider too many things: soldiers, provisions, people's food, troops formation, morale's organization. However, these things weren't needed here. The living souls didn't eat, drink, poop, or sleep. They could be killed with a howl. The key point was that they weren't afraid of death. Because they were already dead. At most, they would die again. The same surprise attack, the same result. There were no death. It was just that there was one less group of officials who abused their power. There was another group of living souls who struggled at the bottom. Of course, there were a few ghost officials who were still standing. They were the most unique group of people in the underworld. They had great wisdom and perseverance. They had held on until now for tens of thousands of years. Finally, they had waited for a chance to change their fate. Therefore, they only watched and observed quietly. They wanted to see what the purpose of these two strange creatures was. What was their route? They killed even more cleanly than in the reincarnation hall. In terms of numbers, they were unstoppable. However, the King of Equality wasn't here. For the time being, they didn't have the chance to deal with the surviving ghost officials. Lu Xiaoyi's face was filled with worry. Oldson, I'm afraid that those so-called kings have already foreseen our actions. It's understandable that the King of Chakravarti is here. However, now that the King of Equality isn't here, it's definitely not a coincidence. I dare say that we still won't be able to stop a single King of Hell in the next Yama Hall. Sindauha's expression was solemn. What do you mean? Lu Xiaoyi smiled bitterly. I'm just reminding you. I don't mean it. Other than continuing, what other choice do we have? I just want to tell you that if you don't want to give up, then be prepared to fight to the death. Chapter 2387. Like a hot knife through butter, this was how they felt during their rebellion. The number of living souls had also increased from 1 to 2,000 to over 1,000,000 now. Of course, it couldn't be compared to the hundreds of millions of living souls in the underworld. But if you exclude those imprisoned in the 18 levels of hell, women, the elderly, children, and those who were timid, this number was normal. In such a short period of time, this was already a remarkable achievement. More importantly, it was enough to deal with the Yama Palace. Soon, they arrived at the last hall, Qin Guang Palace. Daoist's brows furrowed tighter and tighter. There's something fishy about this. None of the 10 Yama kings are missing, but the other ghost envoys in the palace are all present. They're completely unprepared, just like, Lu Xiaoyi continued, just like cannon fodder? I feel the same way. But I'm really not familiar with the underworld. I still don't understand what this means. Oldson, do the 10 Yama Kings have seals or something like that? For example, some special method to control the underworld? Daoistson was also very confused. There should be, right? However, this place was a place where a special power was sealed by a gold immortal. So, what kind of tricks could he play? I haven't done anything specific. To be honest, I'm not too sure. Lu Xiaoyi was speechless. Not sure? You dare to drag me here if you're not sure? At the very least, we have to snatch some special items to control the underworld, right? Now, we've occupied the 10 Yama palaces, but it's the same as not occupying them at all. The two of them were actually the same. The entire operation seemed to be too relaxed, because in their eyes, the souls of these mortals were not a threat at all. With the experience of a half-immortal, what kind of tricks could they play? This shouldn't be the character of cultivators. But no matter how cautious they were, they couldn't ask them to be careful with mortals. This was something rooted in the depths of every cultivator's consciousness. There was no way to stop it. A relaxing trip was what both of them were thinking about. Overthrowing the underworld and establishing a new order didn't seem too difficult when the Immortal Court had basically given up on this place. Their considerations weren't wrong. The Immortal Court had indeed given up on this place, but they didn't consider the fact that the natives here, even if they were the souls of mortals after death, still possessed the same intelligence. They knew about risks, schemes, and tricks. Daoistson comforted him. It's nothing. The Immortal Court had indeed given up on this place. This was confirmed by my contacts with the higher-ups over the years. The 5 fates and 5 virtues had been lost, and there was no foundation to reconstruct the complete cycle of reincarnation. Rather than spending a lot of effort here, it was better to wait until the new era came. What other risks were there? The souls themselves? Or was it some other foreign cultivator? If it's these two things, I believe it won't be difficult for us to deal with them with our abilities. Lu Xiaoyi sighed. I hope so. This Daoistson's ability to strategize really wasn't that great, but he couldn't complain right now. Now that things had come to this, it wasn't in his character to retreat. He could only deal with whatever came his way. Soon, Qin Guang Hall also fell into chaos. The two of them didn't make much of a move, but Qin Guang Hall's ghost officials and ghost soldiers fell into a sea of living souls. Now, some of the living souls were no longer weak. After devouring so many ghost soldiers' strength, many of them had become stronger. Although they were still far from the level of those ghost soldiers, they could still cause harm to the ghost soldiers with their numbers. Daoistson was still among them, helping the living souls deal with the most troublesome ghost officials. However, Lu Xiaoyi came in front of another group of ghost soldiers. This was the group that didn't wallow in evil, the clear stream that had persisted for tens of thousands of years. There were also dozens of them, among which were the judges, black and white impermanence, Oxhead, and Horseface. They were quietly watching from afar. Lu Xiaoyi directly revealed his trump card to them. You must be wondering where the two of us came from. Maybe you already have the direction of your guesses. Then I can tell you now. That's right, we are cultivators from the world of the living. We came here with a purpose. When he advised people, he was always frank and straightforward. He openly stated his purpose, striving to achieve a win-win situation. He believed that this was the fastest way to gain the other party's trust, and not to paint a big picture or threaten. We want to help you break away from this dark life in the underworld. This isn't entirely for you, but also for us to obtain merit. Saving a life is better than building a 7-storied pagoda. Saving a life may not be able to build a 7-storied pagoda, but there may be a 2-storied pagoda or even a 3-storied pagoda. It's of great use to us cultivators. If we can achieve this goal, it will be beneficial to both of us. But now it seems that your masters still want to struggle on their deathbed? I'm telling you all this because you are different from them. After persevering for so many years, it's time to reap the rewards. The judge had the highest position among the group of ghost soldiers. He said, "What are the benefits that exalted immortal is talking about? Still holding the pipa and covering half of your face?" Lu Xiaoyi said concisely, "There are 3 benefits. In terms of the past, if we succeed this time, you can be at ease and do the things that you could only do secretly before. Now that the King Yenluo of Hell has a new master, you can openly promote your own ideals, instead of enduring humiliation and suffering in silence. In terms of the future, if you don't want to stay here anymore, then maybe we can find a way out for you? But I'm not sure now, because those 10 masters are still at large." The judge was very calm. "Sorry, before you control the underworld, we can't promise you anything. Moreover, isn't the control of the underworld in the immortal court? Then, if it's a hypothetical, what right do you have to say that you can decide the future of the underworld?" Lu Xiaoyi smiled slightly. "Then have you thought about why the immortal court has given up on the jurisdiction of the underworld for thousands of years, and no immortal has come down? I can't tell you too much, but there are changes in dynasties in the mortal world, and the same goes for the immortal court. It's just that the changes in the immortal court are not so frequent. You are lucky to be in time for this change. I don't dare to say what will happen, but at least this is an opportunity. Is this what you want to live in, this kind of darkness?" The judge's expression did not change. "With our ability, we may not be able to help you much," Lu Xiaoyi laughed. "There's no need. We don't need your help either. I'm just here to tell you that although our actions seem to be disadvantageous to you, you know very well what we're targeting. It's not the souls that have lived for tens of thousands of years, but the system of the underworld. Now that you have proven your independence under this system, you are the best managers of the underworld in the future. The opportunity is right in front of you, think about it carefully." Chapter 2388. The Battle of Annihilation at Qingguang Palace went on without any mishap. Not a single one escaped. There were still unkillable ghost soldiers, and King Qingguang was still nowhere to be seen. The living souls flew all over the underworld. After being in the underworld for such a long time, they finally had the right to walk freely without being shackled by an iron chain. They could cry or laugh if they wanted to. At this moment, the atmosphere here was not what the underworld should have. Even the dense underworld energy could not stop the living souls from releasing their enthusiasm. It was also at this moment that the sky suddenly became even darker. From the previous dusky sky, it gradually turned blood red. Finally, it was as if the entire underworld was covered in blood. It was so red that it was glaring and terrifying. This was the bloody resentment accumulated over hundreds of thousands of years in the 18 layers of hell. Once it was released, Lu Xiaoyi and Daoists naturally did not mind. However, those living souls, whether they came to watch the show or obtained a portion of their strength through eating, were unable to withstand the ferocious might of the underworld for hundreds of thousands of years. They scattered in a hubbub. The 2 of them did not attempt to stop them, because one could not persuade millions of frightened rabbits. They only quietly looked at the blood-red sky. There, 10 indistinct figures were swaying. Not only were the people swaying, there were also 10 great seals. These were the seals that the 10 Yama kings of the underworld had obtained from immortals. In this special environment, they had a special function. The sinkhole-like underworld suddenly flipped over, wrapping all the souls inside, including the 2 audacious cultivators. However, the 2 of them could not see those souls here. In their senses, it was as if the entire underworld only had the 2 of them and the 10 Yama kings. In the eyes of mortals, this kind of momentum would have scared them witless and helpless. However, who were the 2 of them? They were former immortals with millions of years of cultivation experience. They were people who had passed through caves. There was nothing in this universe that could make them feel afraid. There was only curiosity, an unending thirst for knowledge. The 10 great seals of the underworld represent 10 different underworlds. To break them, I'm afraid we can only break through them one by one. Why don't we have a bet? Let's see who can break the most. The loser has to promise the other one thing. Lu Xiaoyi was never afraid of gambling with others. Ever since he started cultivating, he had never lost a bet. The two of them clapped their hands. King Qinguang's hearty laughter came from the sky. Many thanks to the two of you for getting rid of these traitors for us. In order to thank the two of you for your great kindness, we've set up the 10 purgatory arrays here as a reward for the two of you working so hard to overthrow hell. Don't you want to seize control of hell? The dark seal is right here. If you have the ability, come and take it. Lu Xiaoyi and Daoistsen glanced at each other, then Daoistsen said, "Something seems off. Did someone get here before us?" Lu Xiaoyi shook his head. "I can't tell. Even if someone did come, would they be among the 10 Yama Kings, or would they be hiding somewhere else? Who cares? Let's get rid of these 10 Yama Kings first. Oldson, only one person can go with each seal. Take care of yourself. Don't say I didn't help you." Daoistsen sneered. "You should take care of yourself. Do you really think that I've been an immortal for 1,000,000 years for nothing? Do you think I'll fall into the hands of these wandering souls?" Half-immortals had the pride of half-immortals. How could they shrink back in the face of the threat of these mortal souls? These kings of hell were just relying on the seal of hell bestowed by the immortals to borrow some of the chi of the netherworld. They thought that they could fight for life and death here. This was the thinking of mortals. They would never understand the limits of cultivators. Cultivators and half-immortals were trapped by mortal souls using arrays. Who would believe this? This was the current situation of the two of them. Qin Guang Seal, Chu Jiang Seal, Emperor Song Seal, Wu Guan Seal, King Yenluo Seal, Equality Seal, Mount Tai Seal, Metropolis Seal, Border City Seal, and Reincarnation Seal. 10 large seals spun around in the sky. They were particularly eye-catching against the blood-red background. There didn't seem to be any order. Lu Xiaoyi floated up and went straight for the Qin Guang seal. Since they were going to fight, he would beat the leader first. Although he knew that in the underworld, there wasn't much difference between the 10 Yama Kings in terms of status. Out of the corner of his eye, he saw Daoistsen pounce on the closest reincarnation seal. This was the last thing he saw. In the next moment, he threw himself into the seal. Almost at the same time, he knew that he didn't throw himself into the Qin Guang seal. The 10 dark seals were illusory. What you saw might not be real. Just like when he threw himself into the Qin Guang seal, it was the Chu Jiang seal that went in. Daoistsen threw the reincarnation seal, but he didn't know which seal went in. It didn't matter. In any case, he had to go through them one by one. However, this kind of mistake made him speechless. He had lost his swordsman's great Dao realm and was played by a few mortal souls. It was really embarrassing. He couldn't blame them. Who asked them to come here and walk right into his trap? The Chu Jiang seal specialized in living hell, the ice hell. Once they entered, they would be frozen to the bone. With this kind of temperature, the ownerless souls would be frozen. Their entire bodies, including their minds, would be shattered into countless pieces by the ghost soldiers. They would feel the pain of their bodies shattering, but they wouldn't die. They would reassemble, be frozen solid, and then be shattered by the iron chains. This was the basic method of cultivation in this hell. In this icy world, countless such shattering and reassembling were happening. However, there were no ghost soldiers now. Instead, it was King Chu Jiang's incarnation in the center of hell. His huge body held a thick and long black chain in his hand. As it danced, ghosts howled and screamed. Countless souls that had just reassembled were shattered into ice crystals under the black chain and reassembled freely. Your nose is on my face, but my eyes are on your forehead. For a moment, miserable screams resounded. The air was so thick that it seemed to have materialized. Lu Xiaoyi also felt the stiffness in his body. This was a natural reaction under the extreme cold. However, he wasn't a living soul in the end. Although his great Tao realm was sealed, it couldn't seal his mortal martial arts. No cultivator would practice mortal martial arts after cultivation. That would be driving the reverse cart of cultivation. However, there was no cultivator who didn't know this. This was because what they learned during the Qi cultivation stage was roughly this. They were incomparably familiar with the meridians of the body. Lu Xiaoyi was even more familiar with it. This was because during the years when he was in Jinxiu Heaven and Earth with the Shizhao brothers, he spent a lot of time on using the body's potential that cultivators considered to be unorthodox, especially the Shizhao swordsman brothers who were bored for tens of thousands of years. They figured out many creative explosive abilities that could unleash the potential of a mortal's body to the extreme. No cultivator would do this kind of useless work. Why would they use the vital energy of a mortal when they could solve the problem with their great Tao realm? However, the Shizhao swordsman brothers were different. They were forced to choose this kind of method to increase their battle prowess. Lu Xiaoyi had been with them for many years. He learned this skill well. Without his great Tao realm, he was still a swordsman. Chapter 2389. He circulated the technique from Shizhao's body, and this kind of cold immediately left him. To be honest, compared to the situation in the phoenix nest, this place was already considered very warm. However, he still staggered all the way towards King Chujiang's location, wanting to run into the attack range of the flying sword. When a swordsman who moved unhindered in the universe lost his long-range attack, approaching became the most difficult thing for him. As for what would happen after he got close, it was actually not important. King Chujiang resided in the center of the ice. With a long black chain as the center, the range of his chain attack was within the range of 1,000 feet. It was also within this range that there were thousands upon thousands of densely packed living souls, endlessly circulating between life and death. Lu Xiaoyi carefully sensed, and could already faintly feel a trace of Tao power from King Chujiang's chain attack. It was still very weak and far from being able to form a battle strength, but this kind of change meant that it was unusual. Within the range of the Golden Immortals restriction, even half-immortals like Lu Xiaoyi and Daoists couldn't use half of their Tao state. The seal was firm, but this kind of thing that shouldn't have appeared here could only mean one thing. The netherworld had already begun to show signs of its own Tao will. In other words, the great Tao of reincarnation after the new era leaned towards including mortals into the reincarnation system. This was a very important signal. Coming to the netherworld this time was the right choice. He could clearly feel the pulse of the changes in the era, allowing him to know which direction he should take. The reincarnation system in the mortal world was also a hurdle that couldn't be avoided. And in the reincarnation system in the mortal world, even Hong Mao didn't mention this. He didn't know what the reason was. But there was one thing, like this kind of great Tao system, it was something that was completely based on one's heart. It still had to be created by the Tao-fusing cultivators themselves. Countless thoughts flashed through his mind, but he still approached King Chujiang's chain. This guy comprehended a layer of the netherworld Tao will. It could indeed raise his strength qualitatively, but it also meant that there was a way to kill him. The heavenly Tao was fair. If you were only a soul, no matter how strong or weak you were, you wouldn't die in the netherworld. But if you had already broken away from the category of a pure soul, then there would naturally be the rules of the cultivation world to restrict you. You couldn't take advantage of both the mortal soul and the Tao soul. Therefore, Even if this guy's performance made him feel pressured, since he could kill him, it was not a problem. As he neared the range of the chain, he felt the power of the black chain. What made it difficult for him was the endless suffering souls along the way. In view of his current situation, other than squeezing through these souls, there seemed to be no better way. Having made up his mind, Zhang Xian turned his body to the side without any hesitation. In an instant, countless hands reached out from the surroundings, as though he was a drowning man making his final struggle. If he were to be caught, it would be troublesome. After all, the strength he exerted before his death was not to be underestimated. There was no pity. He would not put himself in danger just because he was pitiful. Moreover, since these people could endure the pain of being frozen, they would not mind being cut off by his sword, right? Other than these never-ending hands, his attention was mainly on the black chain. Only after he came into direct contact with the power of the black chain could he decide on a suitable attack strategy for himself. The only good news was that King Chujiang could not move, because he had to be in this kind of scene of hell. He could only stay in the center of hell and rely on these souls to obstruct the enemy. At the same time, he could also obtain the power of the underworld provided to him by the souls. The black chain arrived like a shadow. Lu Xiaoyi had experience with this kind of weapon. That was on a boat in the dreamland. Therefore, he took advantage of the opportunity to lean his body to the side and block the black chain with his sword 3 feet in front of him, preventing this kind of soft weapon from twisting around him. At the same time, he lunged forward and advanced several feet forward. The method was simple and effective. The only obstacle was those hands that were everywhere. They were very weak, but the strength they exerted before their death was not small. To be precise, this was not an attack, but a subconscious attempt to pull something before their death. This made him very vexed, because this would take up too much energy. He could only let the sword brandish slightly in the surroundings, cutting off every pair of hands that reached over. Sometimes, those hands were only a few inches away from his body. The power of the black chain was very heavy. When it lashed out, it was full of power. However, that was only for those souls. To an expert like him, this kind of chain attack method was inferior to the one he encountered in the dreamland last time. It was just like the old man in the park who was flinging his whip. Power without technique was just a waste of energy. Rushing forward like this, he got closer and closer to the fat King Chujiang. This living king of hell's eyes also revealed a trace of fear. With just a few exchanges of weapons, he already understood the disparity between himself and this foreign cultivator. Therefore, he did not hesitate and let out a shrill howl from his mouth. Under the urging of the chained shadows, thousands upon thousands of souls began to consciously surge towards Lu Xiaoyi. Amidst the surge, they gathered into a human form. Then, under the chain attacks, fragments shot out in all directions. The fragments that shot out in all directions once again gathered into a human. Some of the souls became handicapped without arms or legs. Some of them became 3-legged and 4-armed monsters. Amidst the miserable wails, countless hands reached towards Lu Xiaoyi. Some of the women were screaming at the top of their lungs, some of the brawny men were glaring and roaring, and the withered arms of the elderly were densely covered in dark spots. Lu Xiaoyi was in hell. Even if his heart was in the light, he still could not break away from all the disturbances before his eyes. The sword light swung into a circle of light, and severed limbs scattered around his body. Such a tragic scene was still unable to divert his attention in the slightest. Trying to use this kind of tragic scene to sway his emotions? That was because he did not know how a half-immortal was cultivated. When the distance was close to 300 feet, Lu Xiaoyi's surroundings were already densely packed with overlapping souls. Merely cutting off the limbs was no longer enough to stop these souls from approaching. This was King Chujiang's strategy. He wanted to see if this cultivator's Tao heart was as firm as the legends said. Even in this kind of situation, his state of mind would not be disturbed. As long as the swordsman showed even the slightest bit of mercy, he would immediately be grabbed by countless hands and tightly hugged into a ball. Then, he would lose his ability to resist and be whipped into two by his black chain. But until now, the swordsman still did not show the slightest bit of weakness. It was as if the ones that fell under his sword were not humans, but cows, horses, cats, and dogs. The long sword transformed into a ball of light. Under the tearing, it was actually even more brutal than the whipping of the black chain. King Chujiang's cheek twitched. He secretly sighed at the determination of these cultivators. But today, this cultivator would definitely die here. There was a sinister smile in his eyes. There was no need for the cultivator to be truly weak. The appearance of these souls was already a part of the battle strategy. The black chain was the strength of King Chujiang's lifetime. After soaking in the underworld aura for more than 100,000 years, his strength had already reached a very terrifying level. At a distance of 300 feet, the black chain was as firm as a spear. A thrust of the spear. At the same time, Lu Xiaoyi heard a loud and clear cry of an infant. Chapter 2390. Lu Xiaoyi saw a skinny baby pouncing towards him. The shriveled body represented that he had died of malnutrition. A pair of clear eyes carried a yearning for life as he reached out his hand towards him. Of course, the baby didn't want to do anything to him. This was just an innocent person who was squeezed over by the surging souls. He was still 100 feet away. Another 100 feet and he would be able to catch King Chujiang off guard. This was his way of fighting. First, he would confuse the enemy, then he would make the final decision. His goal was to prevent the other party from using those inexplicable methods. Although he didn't really care, he still felt a trace of threat in the special environment of someone else's territory. The baby was squeezed over, and he couldn't cut it in half with a single slash. This wasn't a matter of being soft-hearted, but a matter of bottom line. A little trouble that was destined to not be a threat. If King Chujiang wanted to use this to create a killing intent for him, then he was thinking too much. In the time it took for a spark to fly off a flint, his left hand scooped up the baby. At the same time, he drew a circle with his long sword to cut off the other souls that were pouncing on him. Following the momentum of the circle, the long sword went towards the black chain. His body's forward momentum didn't change at all. The black chain was as firm as a spear. It collided with Lu Xiaoyi's long sword and created a string of sparks. This wasn't a collision of brute force, but also a mutual exchange of internal energy. It was also at this moment that a few pairs of hands grabbed towards him from behind. He had encountered this kind of situation before. When the long sword was entangled by the black chain, he actually had other methods in his arsenal. For example, he could use his left hand to punch, withdraw his sword, flip it around, and so on. It even included letting these souls grab him. It was just a matter of struggling. This time, he chose to let himself be grabbed by a few pairs of hands. That was because he could immediately seal off the other party when he collided with the black chain. Time was of the essence and couldn't be delayed. Just as the long sword swung out, relying on his rich fighting experience to seal off the black chain that was much stronger than him, he felt a bone-piercing chill from the back of his heart even without turning his head. That was an instinct bestowed upon him by 3,000 years of fighting experience. Under the instinct, his waist and abdomen twisted forcefully, shifting the dislocation of his bones and tendons. His muscles instantly bulged like steel. However, this wave of cold energy was really too close. Because he had long gotten used to the harassment of those living souls' hands, this bit of distance really wasn't enough for him to make a complete response. Because of his quick reflexes, the sharp weapon didn't pierce his back, but it still pierced his internal organs. a dignified half-immortal, the #1 sword in the universe that struck fear into the hearts of all opponents in the cultivation world, was actually stabbed by a mortal. Who would believe this? But it was happening right in front of his eyes. The wound was very deep, but this was not the most important thing. The most important thing was that the netherworld chi that belonged exclusively to the netherworld was a great supplement to living souls, but to living people, it was a liver-destroying poison. But Lu Xiaoyi's reaction was different from what King Chujiang had imagined. This human cultivator didn't panic, didn't explode with rage, didn't heal his injuries, and didn't even turn around to look. The soul of the infant in his hand was clearly a part of the plan. It was not torn to shreds in his rage. Instead, it was gently pushed aside. It was as if nothing had happened. The distance was already close to 60 meters when the human suddenly charged forward. It was completely different from the state where he was frozen stiff by the cold energy earlier. The living souls were simply unable to keep up with the human's speed. The dense area that was formed from surrounding and pouncing on the human was now in a mess because the human suddenly broke away. There were very few living souls in front of him, and they were no longer able to effectively slow him down. When had King Chujiang encountered such an abnormal opponent in these hundreds of thousands of years? His black chain was also unable to turn back for a moment because it was too long. Just like this, Lu Xiaoyi had already closed in on him. His long sword didn't have any fancy moves, and it was just a simple sudden stab. In reality, the sudden stab started from 60 meters away. With a kick, a step, and a raise of his hand, the long sword had already directly penetrated through King Chujiang's gorgeous clothes. The sword chi of the mortal world burst forth. This kind of attack was useless against a pure living soul, but it was very fatal to King Chujiang, who had already comprehended a trace of Tao insight. Because he was no longer a pure living soul. He had always been good at scheming, and had an extremely deep understanding of the situation and people's hearts. A perfect assassination in an environment he was familiar with, but the curtains fell in the opponent's completely unreasonable sudden attack. King Chujiang had some understanding. Those who were fanning themselves shouldn't face the villain face to face. This was using a weak point to attack the enemy's strong point, and this was the cause of his death. For a moment, he was a little confused. Were his breakthroughs these past few years a gain or a loss? After comprehending a trace of the Tao of the netherworld, he finally broke away from the category of living souls, but instead, he lost his life here. Was the heavens joking with him? Gaining the Tao, losing his life. If he could start all over again, what would he choose? When King Chujiang was on the verge of death, all the living souls in the frost hell were no longer restless. They hid far away in fear as they looked at this existence who dared to kill King Yanluo. They didn't dare to resist, but they also couldn't stay far away. It was just like what they had been experiencing ever since they entered the netherworld. He was thinking, if this human wanted to know something, he might be able to keep his life by selling the information, even if he had to start from the living souls again. He had also once thought, if he had to start all over again, would he have the courage to do so? He thought he wouldn't. When he imagined those living souls trembling under his black chains, he didn't dare to imagine how he would persevere if he returned to this kind of state. He might as well just end it all. But now, when he was truly facing life and death, he discovered that his desire to live was exceptionally strong. It was even stronger than 100,000 years ago. Immortality was truly a poison. When you got used to all of this, you wouldn't be able to part with it anymore. But this human cultivator didn't ask anything. He only swallowed and spat out sword chi on his sword, exterminating that trace of Tao intent within his soul. King Chujiang opened his mouth with difficulty. Actually, I can tell you a few things. The human was indifferent. King Chujiang was a little anxious. He didn't have much time left. You might not believe me if I tell you, but we also want to establish a new order in the netherworld. It's completely different from before. Ever since we comprehended a trace of Tao intent, we understood a lot of things. We tolerated and even indulged you guys to kill us because the biggest obstacle to change came from these low-level ghost servants. Lu Xiaoyi looked at him playfully. He raised 3 fingers, indicating that he still had 3 breaths of time. King Chujiang suddenly opened his eyes wide. He was unable to understand this person. Didn't the reason he came to the netherworld was to find out some secrets? Now that the secret was right before his eyes, he was actually indifferent? Someone is instigating it. Otherwise, we wouldn't have improved so quickly. But I won't tell you who it is. Unless you remove this damnable sword. I'm King Chujiang. I won't satisfy your curiosity under humiliation. The tip of the sword trembled. King Chujiang opened his eyes wide. He had finished the last journey of his 10+ years of life. In the end, he still wanted to gamble, but he lost. Chapter 2391. When he was completely dead, Lu Xiaoyi opened his mouth. I don't care about your secrets, I only care about my intentions. I'm not here to listen to stories, I'm here to do something. Regardless of whether you're willing or not, there's only one outcome if you stop me. Your idea might be good, but the process isn't good, it's too cruel and bloody. How can you prove that your current understanding can change your way of doing things? In the end, it's just one sentence, I don't like this kind of netherworld. Lu Xiaoyi turned around, looked at the thousands of living souls in the ice-cold netherworld, and said indifferently, Do we know each other? A living soul floated out with a twisted face, Splendid heaven and earth, you killed the horse bandit's 5th boss when you fell. I worked like a horse here and finally became a ghost officer, but in the end, I was beaten back to my original form by you. Lu Xiaoyi stared blankly. So that's how it is. Then, you stabbed me once, is the grudge between us settled? That living soul stared blankly for a long time. If us living souls can have a good reincarnation method in the future, the time in the netherworld, then it'll be settled. Lu Xiaoyi nodded. All right, I'll try my best. Splendid heaven and earth's 5th boss was an unlucky fellow who was crushed to death by him when he fell. It was also because of this kind of karma that he stood out among the thousands of living souls to plot against him. Lu Xiaoyi judged that the living souls here didn't have the guts to truly make a move against him. His judgment was correct, but his luck wasn't good. He couldn't be bothered to investigate the exact process of the plot as there were too many aspects. King Chujiang, the child, the 5th boss, and actually also the thousands of living souls here. This was a complicated process, and King Chujiang was very impressive. He was able to mix together so many coincidences, and even a veteran like him fell for it. Actually, when the living souls surged up like a tide, this was already the predestined result. He was only a powerful mortal now, but not a powerful cultivator. He was destined to be unable to avoid the things that mortals were bound to encounter. There was nothing to complain about. Even though his breadth of mind wasn't big, he wouldn't vent his anger on the infant and the 5th boss. One was a child who couldn't control himself, and the other was a blood feud. Both of them had their reasons. What King Chujiang said was meaningless because he'd never believed in speaking the truth before death since he'd cultivated for 3,000 years. When a person is about to die, their words are kind. This is wrong. In fact, the only thing a person will do before death is to extend their life, even if it's for 1 day or 2 hours. For this reason, they were willing to tell a big lie. Therefore, he never listened to the heartfelt words of others before they died. It was very likely that they were digging a hole for you before they died, especially such a cunning old soul that had lived for more than 100,000 years. His thoughts had nothing to do with knowing the secrets of the King Yanluo of Hell. In the eyes of the living souls, these Yama kings were high and mighty, but in his eyes, even if they had lived for hundreds of thousands of years, they were still the souls of mortals. Their way of thinking was a joke to him. The most troublesome thing was the wound on his back. It was not light at all. The chi of the netherworld kept drilling into his body, and the wound was bleeding non-stop. Even if he sealed his acupuncture points, it would not stop the bleeding. He had to speed up. Scooping up his hand, he grasped the small seal that King Chuzhang's soul dropped after his death. That was the King Chuzhang's seal. If he wanted to completely control the underworld, he might need to gather 10 of them. With the small seal in his hand, the frost hell disappeared. Those living souls that had escaped from the disaster dispersed in a hubbub. No one came to thank him, they only treated it as a dogfight between the higher-ups. Exiting the frost array, the blood-colored sky reappeared in front of his eyes. The underworld's great formation was still there, and there were 7 seals hanging on it. It was a little embarrassing. How could a hired thug like him not be as fast as Daoistsen? He had only dealt with 1, but Daoistsen had already dealt with 2. Without any hesitation, he charged towards the underworld's great formation again. He did not care which one he entered, he had no choice anyway. King Wuguan, blood pool hell. The red here was no longer a color, but a blood that was filled with a sticky feeling. Thousands upon thousands of living souls fell into the blood pool. Under the strong corrosive blood, they were slowly decomposed into blood corpses, blood clots, blood fragments, and blood droplets. This process was obviously very painful. The mournful howls did not stop for even a moment, continuous and deafening. During the decomposing process, some of the blood clots began to sink to the bottom, and were thrown out from the bottom of the blood pool. Then, they slowly turned into living souls. The process was as slow as they were being dissolved, and the pain was as deep. The only difference was that one was the pain of being torn apart and decomposed, and the other was the pain of being split and expanded. Compared to the frost hell's quick death and quick rebirth, the painful process here was even worse. King Wuguan was hidden in the depths of the blood pool, controlling everything in the underworld. When he smelled the trace of blood from the wound on the human's back, he smiled in satisfaction. Soul blood was completely different from the blood of a living person, so he was able to sense it at the first possible moment. That idiot, King Chuzhang, had lost his life in the hands of this person, yet he'd finally done something meaningful before dying. When a living person entered the blood pool with injuries, not only would they have to endure the unforgettable pain of 10,000 ants crawling on their blood, the Een soul's blood would also corrode the blood of a living person especially intensely. No one could endure this kind of pain. In his hundreds of thousands of years of memories of controlling the blood pool hell, he had never seen anyone who could endure it. Willpower had a limit. Sometimes, pain was even harder to endure than death. Very few people could understand this principle, because there was only one of the 18 layers of hell. Cultivators might be able to do it, but in the underworld there were no cultivators. King Wuguan stared at the human outside, wondering what method he would use to attack him. In any case, he would not leave the blood pool, not even if he was beaten to death. That idiot King Chuzhang thought that his martial strength was outstanding. Not only did he snatch the first round, he even competed with this person in courage, and the result was, among the 2 humans who came to the underworld to cause trouble, they valued the guy who pretended to be an immortal more than the follower who pretended to be an immortal. It was said that the human cultivators in the Yang realm paid the most attention to status and seniority, and status and seniority represented strength. So, the performance of the 2 people when they first entered the array also proved this point. The human who pretended to be an immortal quickly passed through 2 rounds, but the follower only passed through 1 round, and was even seriously injured in the end. The difference between them was self-evident. It was also because of this judgment that the Underworld Great Array's main core function was used in the direction of the fake immortal. Right now, it was steadily expanding. Although 3 of the 10 Yama Kings had already been defeated, They were confident that they could obtain the final victory in the following battle. Fighting with one drum, weakening with the second, and exhausting with the third, who didn't have a few tricks up their sleeves. Under King Wuguan's gaze, the moment the human entered the blood pool hell, he did not hesitate or observe. Like a rash youth, he plunged headfirst into the blood pool, without hesitation. Chapter 2392. Pain. Extreme pain. This kind of pain was not the kind of pain one would feel when a sword pierced the body, nor was it the dull pain of internal problems, but the kind of pain one would feel when one's blood was corroded by thousands of ants. Where could the blood flow to? Every part of the body was filled with capillaries. One could imagine the extent of this pain. As long as there was blood, it would burn and corrode. The feeling of melting was as if one's body was about to melt. Lu Xiaoyi had never experienced such pain in his 3,000 years of cultivation. It could be said that this one time made up for all the pain he should have experienced in his life. It was also a kind of balance in the Tao of heaven. Even the sword in his hand was numb. That was the reaction of his fingers being close to losing feeling. This kind of reckless action was a little too impulsive, but Lu Xiaoyi had no other choice. At this time, the secret of the mortal body passed down from Shi Zhao could not help him, because the Shi Zhao swordsman did not cultivate blood. Other than willpower, there was no other way to help him endure this kind of pain. It was as if he was on the verge of collapse at every moment. There was a voice tempting him. As long as he jumped out of this pool of blood, he would be free from this sea of suffering. But he was unmoved. In the process of his cultivation, mental strength had always been the most important. Starting from Zhuji, he had never given up on cultivating his mental strength in every realm. Pain could collapse a person's nerves. That was because one's nerves were not tough enough. Lu Xiaoyi's nerves were like thousand-year-old vines, the kind that was soaked in tung oil, so he was still smiling, even if this kind of smile was uglier than crying. He just sped up. The more pain he felt, the faster he ran, as if he could throw the pain to the back of his mind. He told himself that there were actually two ways to resolve the pain. One was to run outside, run back. The other was to run inside, kill his way out. After persisting for a while, to him, running to King Wuguan's side to kill him was actually closer than running back. The core of resolving pain tolerance was what kind of psychological suggestion you gave yourself. Successful people would hint to themselves that they would succeed if they took another step forward. Lozer's psychological suggestion was that they would be free from the sea of suffering if they took a step back. As long as you chose the right direction, everyone could actually endure this kind of pain. But the problem was, when the pain came, how many people could think calmly? King Wuguan stared blankly at this fellow, whose blood seemed to be burning as he ran in front of him, and raised his sword. He finally understood how King Chu Jiang died. He was killed by his recklessness. Once this human got close to him, King Wuguan's resistance would be a joke. He was not good at this to begin with. His burning blood finally stopped boiling. Those who had not experienced it would definitely think that it was an incomparable relaxation and pleasure, but Lu Xiaoyi knew that it was not relaxation, but a kind of soreness that came from his soul. It was as if his blood had been replaced with vinegar, and even his bone marrow had been filled with vinegar. It wasn't a sore feeling, but a soreness and weakness. The second King Yanluo's seal was the seal of the 5 officials. When the blood pond hell disappeared, Lu Xiaoyi looked up and saw 6 seals still hanging in the sky. Daoist's speed wasn't very good this time, but Lu Xiaoyi knew that it was probably because he was rushing too fast. His body could still withstand it. It was hard to say. What would be left of the body after it was sealed by a golden immortal? This was a very profound question. Strictly speaking, the so-called seal could theoretically only seal things within the scope of their knowledge. For example, everything related to the 36 innate great Taos? But he had an understanding that did not belong to the 36 innate great Taos, especially on the Tao of reincarnation. The instant he seized the King Zhang's seal, he was like these kings of hell, and was no longer a pure soul and mortal body. This might not allow his strength to recover, but it could imperceptibly increase his endurance. Therefore, because the kings of hell comprehended Tao intent, they became capable of dying from immortality. While he obtained a trace of Tao intent of reincarnation, he went from capable of dying to immortality. This was the difference between mortals and cultivators who comprehended the same Tao intent. Mortals could not carry the Tao. Now that he had 2 King of Hell's seals in hand, his Tao Qi already had some effect, but he still let the wound on his back bleed red. This was only a kind of disguise. It was not for these kings of hell, but for the real enemy that might be hiding in the dark, a certain cultivator. Was comprehending Tao intent so easy? Or was it a soul that knew nothing about the outside world? Or was it a mortal soul? Even if it was a sufficiently strong mortal soul? Just before the end of the era? Just when the universe was changing? There must be some special condition that brought about such a change. It could be a person, but it could also be an object. He was not sure. But to him and Taoists, this hidden existence was their true opponent. Otherwise, how could these kings of hell let them beat those ghost officials and ghost soldiers back to their original forms? To a bureaucratic system, the most important thing was not how high one's official position was, but how many people one could manage. Everyone wanted to have 100 responses with a single call, to wield real power, and not to be a vase in name only, without someone to pour tea and flatter. What was the fun in such a position? To be able to make the 10 kings of hell give up on their subordinates who had followed them for tens of thousands of years, the temptation in front of them was definitely not small. What was it? He still could not guess. But it was definitely related to the new era, to the general trend of the universe. Someone brought in news of the outside world, and under this opportunity, these old kings of hell could not sit still. It was a pity that he did not ask Daoist Cien. Who else could freely enter and leave the netherworld besides him? Did all immortals have such an ability? Or were they the only ones who had worked in the netherworld before? This was a poorly prepared operation full of mistakes. Sighing in his heart, Lu Xiaoyi continued to break through. Next, he entered King Biancheng's city of death in vain, King Taishan's hell of meat paste, King Songdi's hell of black rope, King Dusher's hell of stifling walk, and now he just entered King Qingguang's seal space. There was one thing that made him very vigilant, and that was, after Daoists and smoothly passed 2 levels in a row, he plunged into the 3rd level and did not come out again. This meant trouble, big trouble, but other than dealing with the other kings of Hell's palace as soon as possible, he had no other ideas. Hopefully this guy won't die just like that, right? I wonder what will happen if he dies here and is reborn? The Qingguang Palace and the Reincarnation Palace were relatively special existences in the 10 kings of Hell's palace. The Reincarnation Palace specialized in dissecting ghosts, distinguishing good from evil, determining their ranks, and sending them to reincarnate. On the other hand, the Qingguang Palace specialized in managing longevity and premature death, birth and death in the human world, and unified the punishment in the netherworld, as well as the luck and misfortune of the next life. The positions of these 2 palaces in the netherworld were also very special. The other 8 palaces were in the giant sinkhole, and only these 2 palaces were outside the giant sinkhole. In the stories of mortals, they were outside the giant sinkhole. Chapter 2393. There was no hell in Qingguang's space. There was only a huge mirror known as the Karma Mirror. It was 1,000 feet tall, and the mirror had 10 circumferences. It hung to the east, and there were 7 words written on it: there are no good people in front of the karma mirror. On the day of a good person's death, there will be a guide to the afterlife. Any man or woman who seduces both merits and demerits will be sent to the 10th hall to be reborn. Men will become women and women will become men. They will be rewarded according to their karma. Escorting evil souls, the danger of seeing the world, the danger of death in hell. At that time, one would know that one couldn't bring 10,000 taels of gold. One would only be accompanied by sin. After entering the mirror, one would be sentenced to the 2nd hall and be tortured in prison. There were no living souls that Lu Xiaoyi had seen in the various hells. The entire Qin Guang Hall was empty. There was only a figure standing majestically on the high platform beside the karma mirror. It was the first Yama King, King Qinguang. When he saw Lu Xiaoyi, he glared and shouted, "There are many resentful ghosts on the road to the netherworld. There are no good people in front of the karma mirror. No matter who you are, you should be shown on by my karma mirror. Since you want to overthrow the netherworld, do you dare to be shown on by my karma mirror? If you don't, there is no reason for what you have done today to exist." Lu Xiaoyi laughed. "Why wouldn't I dare? Just shine it." King Qinguang moved the karma mirror and focused the light. His movements were skillful as he chanted and shone the huge karma mirror at Lu Xiaoyi's location. Immediately, the karma mirror was filled with blood-red light and killing intent. How rich was a cultivator's blood and qi! Compared to mortals, it was a completely different concept. Starting from the 3rd stage of qi refinement, he had been killing non-stop. From mortals to qi refinement cultivators, to foundation establishment Jin Dan, to perfected yuanying, the blood-red light surged, and the karma mirror couldn't contain it. When he became a half-immortal, the entire karma realm could no longer be distinguished by color. There was only red. Further down, the karma mirror began to creak as though it was about to shatter. This was the first time in the history of Qin Guang Hall's karma mirror. King Qinguang was flustered. He was not a stubborn person. He wanted to give up at this moment. He no longer wanted to see through the evil deeds of this swordsman, because the scene just now was too shocking and too unbelievable. Those powerful humans, whom he would treat as gods in the mortal world, died one after another in the hands of this swordsman. How could the puny underworld resist such an evil person? However, once the retribution mirror was activated, the subsequent process would not be under his control. He had to clearly see the soul that was being illuminated. This was a necessary process. This mirror was specially made by the Golden Immortals for such a rule. Therefore, although there were creaking sounds, it didn't really break. However, Qin Guangwang didn't know what would happen to the karma mirror if there were more. He looked at Lu Xiaoyi with fear and a pleading look on his face. Lu Xiaoyi smiled and waved his hand. "It's almost over." Yes, it was finally over. King Qinguang was absent-minded and dumbfounded. The karma mirror showed that the number of human deaths alone exceeded 1,000. If the other cultivators in the universe were included, the number would have exceeded 1,000,000. Killing one person was a crime, but killing 1,000,000 was a hero. Such a person should not be judged by the underworld. Moreover, many of the people who were killed were immortal-like figures in his heart. One of them, in particular, had immortal grief when he died. That was the scene of a true immortal falling. He trembled and didn't dare to raise his head. It was normal for such a person to destroy the 6 Yama halls in one fell swoop. Continue watching. Isn't it not over yet? After the karma mirror shines, there will naturally be a judgment. Why don't you look at your so-called justice and see how I'm judged? If you judge me to go to the 18th level of hell, there's no need to remove me. I'll go down and accept my punishment. King Qinguang could only look at the karma mirror and say that he didn't dare. He really didn't dare. The key was that he didn't have the ability to do so. Even if such a person died, the underworld wouldn't care. The immortal court's management of the cultivation system was not within his jurisdiction. However, this swordsman was right about one thing. After the karma mirror shines, it was a judgment. The evil person would naturally be sent to the 18th level of hell. This was the procedure. In the karma mirror, the bloody light slowly faded. Since they were talking about sins, it was time to talk about merit. In King Qinguang's opinion, the person in front of him was the most evil person in the world of the living. In the hundreds of thousands of years of the poor underworld, no evil person had killed more than 1/100th of the people he killed. If such a person didn't go to hell, who should? What merits did he need to talk about? What could he do? However, the karma mirror's performance was beyond his expectations. The karma mirror judged merits and sins by looking at the depth of the bloody light. If there was a bloody light, then there was a sin. If there was a good person, then the bloody light would be completely washed away, revealing a scene of flowers and auspicious aura. After hundreds of thousands of years, there were many truly good people who could achieve a beautiful scene. There were even very few who could have several auspicious auras. Those were all people who had accumulated great merit in their previous lives. The bloody light in the karma mirror was quickly disappearing. The speed was beyond his imagination. He was wondering if there was something wrong with the karma mirror, and it had completely lost control. However, after careful inspection, there was nothing abnormal. It was very normal. The reason the bloody light was disappearing so quickly was because this person's merits could offset the sins of killing people. From condensed to thin like water, from bright red to light red, from bright red to light red, it took less than 10 breaths from start to finish. In the next moment, the karma mirror's light suddenly changed, from red to green flowers in all 4 seasons. Fresh flowers bloomed all over the mirror, filling the mirror and the screen. They were full of vitality and were incomparably beautiful. The merits had already covered up the sins. It didn't stop. When there was no more space in the karma mirror to contain the flowers, a ray of auspicious aura spread out, dense and auspicious. Then, there was another ray and another ray. There was no end to it, and another ray after another. It was like a newborn sun, shining brightly. King Qinguang fell to the ground, completely losing the ability to think. How much merit did this person have to be to offset the slaughter of millions of lives? Was this person a human or a saint? Lu Xiaoyi finished pretending and was satisfied. He pointed at the karma mirror and asked, "Is the karma mirror damaged?" King Qinguang knelt on the ground. "The karma mirror is normal. I was blind." Lu Xiaoyi asked again, "It's true that I killed millions. But it's also true that I saved hundreds of millions of lives. Auspicious signs should be like this for me. Do you have any doubts?" King Qinguang sighed in admiration. "A saint has descended to the mortal world." Old Xiaoyi waved his hand. "I'm not a saint. Don't use this title to restrain me. In the future, I will still save people, but I will also kill people. Life and death is the balance of the heavenly Tao. Then, since the karma mirror has shone on me, for the sake of fairness, if you want to speak to me as an equal, shouldn't you also look at yourself?" King Qinguang was stunned. This request didn't seem excessive? At this point, he had also extinguished any thoughts of resistance. He was a saint who could kill until rivers of blood flowed in the mortal realm. With the previous 6 kings of hell as a precedent, he also understood that this bit of ability of his was completely insufficient. Seeing the 6 seals hanging on the other party's waist, which belonged to his former colleagues, he didn't have any other thoughts and stood up. As the saying goes, the pavilion closest to the water enjoys the moonlight first. Since I am King Qinguang, I reflect on myself every day. There's nothing I don't dare to do. Chapter 2394. To Lu Xiaoyi's surprise, King Qinguang stood Dafa in front of the mirror of karma. In an instant, the mirror of karma was activated again and began to judge this person's merits and demerits. This was an evil person. An unpardonable evil person. He was an evil person who had been captured from the universe when the underworld was first formed. By chance, he had become the king of Qingguang Hall. It had been hundreds of thousands of years since then. However, when the mirror of karma shone and finally judged him, the blood-red color at the beginning had long disappeared. However, it was not a flower-like brocade, but a balanced color. Of course, it was not that he could affect the mirror of karma because he was the king of Qingguang Hall. This was an artifact made by the golden immortals for the underworld. It was not something that a mortal soul could change. Not to mention hundreds of thousands of years, even 1,000,000 years would be useless. There was only one reason. Since this person took charge of the king of Qingguang Hall, more than trillions of souls had passed through his hands. However, none of them had complained. According to the mirror of karma, those who were guilty were sent to hell to be punished, and those who were innocent were reincarnated. Of course, as for the degree of punishment, it was the business of the 8 halls below. It was not his responsibility. Those who were reincarnated would be dealt with by the reincarnation hall. If there was anything fishy about it, it had nothing to do with him. He was only responsible for the approval of the documents. Therefore, after hundreds of thousands of years, the mirror of karma was neither popular nor auspicious. Lu Xiaoyi suddenly realized that he had shot himself in the foot. He wanted to find a reason to kill this guy, but in the end, he was affected and could not do it. This was his habit of doing things. Since he had asked him to look at the mirror, of course, he had to decide whether to do it or not based on the situation in the mirror. Just as he was still hesitating, King Qingguang was very smart. He knew that his situation would make things difficult for this guy, who was either an evil person or a saint, so it was best to do something. At least for now, he was a saint. He handed over his Qingguang seal. I can't stop what you are doing. I am limited by what I know and can't say that I support you. I can only give you the seal and wait for changes. Lu Xiaoyi calmly took it and didn't refuse. He pinned it to his waist. There were 7 rings in a circle, just like a fake seal. King Qingguang had lost his official seal. He sat cross-legged on the karma mirror with his eyes closed. It seemed that he didn't want to help or stop anything. He was a really smart person. He knew that no matter what he did, the change in front of him was not something he could get involved in. Even if he found the right direction and followed the right person, it was still a problem whether he could last until the change came. Lu Xiaoyi did not go overboard and did not force him. He stepped out of the formation and looked at the sky. At this moment, only the Chakravarti King's seal was left in the mansion of the Dead's decagonal formation. Now that he was only 1 step away, it didn't mean that it would be easy. Although Daoist's combat ability was inferior to his, he had lived for 1,000,000 years as an immortal, giving him a wealth of experience and vast knowledge. If he was still trapped in the reincarnation hall, then there must be something special. He slammed his body against it, but it didn't budge. This meant that there was someone inside. Before this, he had no other choice but to wait. However, now that he had 7 official seals in his hand, he wouldn't wait here foolishly. Hence, he twisted his waist and the 7 official seals at his waist swayed together. As he twisted more and more vigorously, the seals collided with each other and made a crisp sound. The formation of the reincarnation hall couldn't hold on any longer and gradually revealed the truth. The reincarnation hall was still operating even in the midst of the battle. This was because there were always souls that had to be reincarnated, so it couldn't stop. However, there were no reapers in the hall. They had been killed by Lu Xiaoyi in the first wave of attack. In the high hall, there was a fat man in a red robe, a green hat, and black boots. He was writing rapidly. It was obvious that he was checking off the qualifications of the souls that had been allowed to be reincarnated. He was so focused that it was as if he didn't see the abnormality in front of him and was indifferent to Lu Xiaoyi's arrival. There was also a Reaper's, the only one left in the reincarnation hall. She was also the most famous one in the mortal world, Meng Po. Her head was wrapped in a green cloth, and she wore a floral jacket. Her small feet were like golden lotuses. Her face was full of wrinkles, but her smile was kind and amiable. Her hands were very nimble. Her right hand held a broken black porcelain bowl, and her left hand scooped out bowls of Meng Po's soup from the food bucket beside her feet. She passed it to everyone who passed by. This was a dark river. It wasn't wide, but it was deep and bottomless. There were 6 bridges on the river. They were the bridge of helplessness made of gold, silver, jade, and wooden planks. This was the most popular legend in the mortal world. The first 5 bridges represented the living conditions of the souls that were about to be reincarnated. Of course, those who crossed the golden bridge were rich and noble, followed by the silver bridge. When it came to the broken wooden plank bridge, it indicated the beginning of your life in the mortal world. The souls who crossed the bridge were pushing and shoving each other. Some were happy, some were dissatisfied, some were unwilling, and some couldn't resist, but no one urged them. There might have been in the past, but now that there were no more reapers, they naturally followed their wishes. However, they had already been decided on which bridge they could cross, so they couldn't be confused. Even if they were dissatisfied with their future, and were left behind by others when they were born, reincarnation was still a good thing. There was a time limit, and they couldn't afford to delay it. Therefore, after making a fuss, they could only obediently follow orders and take whichever bridge they were supposed to take. However, after the 5 bridges, they still had to take the bridge of helplessness because there was only one Meng Po here. He couldn't find Priest Sin, but Lu Xiaoyi was very sure that he was here. It was a natural, smooth, and harmonious scene of reincarnation. However, it was precisely because of this harmony that it made people feel that there was something strange about it. No one paid attention to him, as if no one saw him. This kind of silence made people feel strange, but to him, he had already seen too much in his life. Life was long, and the heart was like an old vine. He walked towards the direction of the Chakravarti king. After a few steps, a gentle breeze blew in from outside the hall. The wind blew the name list, which swayed as it passed through the Chakravarti king's body. Therefore, Lu Xiaoyi knew that the scene in the hall was actually a spatial projection. He could understand that there was a beginner Tao in the underworld, and it was a brand new Tao. However, if someone could create such a spatial illusion, whether it was a present or a playback, it would be very shocking, because this ignored the rules of the Golden Immortals. He no longer paid attention to the hall and the Chakravarti king. Instead, he focused on the bridge of helplessness. As he observed quietly, a smile appeared on his face. Among the reincarnated souls, a very strange thing had mixed in. It was dressed in a Taoist robe and had a sage-like demeanor. It looked a little confused as it stepped onto the golden bridge amidst the envious faces of the crowd. It took the soup of Meng Po and drank it in one gulp. Then, it lifted the bowl and walked across the bridge. A moment later, it appeared in front of the golden bridge at the head of the bridge of helplessness. This was an endless cycle. Chapter 2395. Did Priest Sin fall into a trap? He didn't know whether to laugh or cry. But when he thought about it carefully, it did make sense. Priest Sin was different from him. Priest Sin played mind games and relied on his knowledge and foresight. How could he be like a butcher who wielded a sword? But the advantage of being a butcher was that he would be finished if he wasn't fierce enough, and he would be finished if he was fierce enough. The advantage of playing mind games was that it was easy and elegant. He could play someone stronger than him to death, but the problem was that he could also die in the hands of someone more sinister than him. Priest Sin's situation might be like this. He played King Yama and King Pingdeng to death very smoothly, but fell into the hands of the Chakravarti king here? He fell into a cycle of life and death. Lu Xiaoyi followed the souls and rushed forward. He bumped into a big bump in front of the golden bridge, and then tried one by one until the wooden plank broke the bridge and allowed him to pass. This meant that if he really died and had to start all over again, he might be a beggar, a slave, or an orphan. Not bad. He could eat his fill and the whole family wouldn't be hungry. If he was unlucky, the whole family would be finished. He stepped onto the wooden plank bridge. This place was different from the reincarnation hall. It wasn't a spatial projection, but a real scene. Looking at the rickety figure on the swaying broken bridge in front of him, he found it funny. This should be called Grandma's Bridge. He hoped it wasn't Grandma Wolf. Mengpa wasn't surprised by his arrival. Perhaps to her, her only responsibility was to give everyone a mouthful of soup and an encouraging smile, no matter where they went or where they were born. Lu Xiaoyi took the broken black porcelain bowl. He thought about the billions of people who had left their lips and saliva on it for tens of thousands of years. He suppressed the discomfort in his heart, tilted his head up, and drank it in one gulp. A spicy taste went straight into his throat. Carefully distinguishing, there were pepper, chili, beef, bone broth, starch, fine vermicelli, daylily, peanuts, fungus, and other ingredients. They were placed neatly. He couldn't help but laugh. "Where are you from, Mengpa?" But he couldn't hear a reply. He could only watch as the old face smiled more and more kindly and distant. There was light in front of them. There were two passageways. All the living souls subconsciously ran towards the light path on the left, because they could feel the aura of life in front of this path. That was a brand new world, a brand new life experience. However, Lu Xiaoyi did not leave. He looked at the other passageway. The passageway was blocked by a barrier. No one could pass through it. If he couldn't pass through, then he would use his sword to slash through. With a swing of the sword, the light screen shattered, and the entire passage collapsed and blocked. A voice shouted, "There are differences between cultivators and mortals. Are you special?" Lu Xiaoyi sneered. "There's a difference between a cultivator and a mortal. However, this difference shouldn't be forced upon him by others. Whether they could cultivate or not, whether they were mortals or not, all of these should be controlled by themselves, not by some rule or will. No matter what you represent, you can only represent yourself and not others. In this world, every living being had the right to choose their own path. Whether it was right or wrong, it was their own choice and not something that was given to them. I don't recognize your cultivation as a mortal." Two more passageways appeared in front of them. One glowed with treasure light and the other glowed with gray light. The living souls ran from the two paths according to the judgment of the netherworld. However, Lu Xiaoyi still refused to obey. He waved his sword and opened a gap between the two passageways, allowing the two passageways to merge into one. This made the living souls somewhat at a loss. That voice shouted again, "There are differences between nobility and lowliness. This was determined by the previous life. Are you an exception?" Lu Xiaoyi retorted, "Life and death are fated. Nobility and lowliness are in the heavens, but not in the previous life. If everyone is determined by their previous life, then what's the meaning of life? The meaning of life is change. The bad things become good, and the good things become even better. This process is the true meaning of life. Your reincarnation has fixed the trajectory of life on the gains and losses of the past. Who knows how much evil is actually just an accident? What they lack is a chance to correct themselves. The meaning of life is change, and not the continuation of the past. Deepening their impression in the netherworld and leaving the imprint of the previous life after reincarnating, I don't recognize such nobility and lowliness." Light and shadow rotated and the stars moved. Two more passageways appeared in the space. One was good and the other was evil. That voice mocked. Then, please tell me, those who were evil in their previous life have the right to be good? Those who were good in their previous life will definitely be evil? Lu Xiaoyi's sword light stirred and completely destroyed the two passageways. Reincarnation shouldn't predetermine good and evil. The so-called human nature is good and human nature is evil. Both are wrong. Human nature is a blank piece of paper. It has countless possibilities. Therefore, if there are lotuses that come from the mud and giant worms that come from the temple, what does it have to do with the previous life? If reincarnation only looks forward and not backward, then there will only be more and more evil people in this world. This isn't the true meaning of reincarnation. Therefore, I don't recognize your reincarnation. The light and shadow collapsed and all the illusions disappeared. Lu Xiaoyi found himself back on the bridge of helplessness. The living souls were still bustling about, shuttling back and forth. However, that soup woman Meng was no longer on the bridge of helplessness. No one was scooping soup? The living souls all stopped on the bridge. Such a change made them somewhat at a loss. Seeing that the bridge was about to be blocked, Lu Xiaoyi had no choice but to pick up the big bowl and scooped up the spicy soup. He was still thinking that this soup was too monotonous. If he really did it here, he should add in mutton giblets soup, winter melon meatballs soup, pork ribs and seaweed soup, tomato and egg soup. As he scooped, a guy in a Taoist robe walked in front of him. Lu Xiaoyi sighed and splashed out a bowl of soup, drenching that guy's head and face. To think that you were once an immortal! How have you been played by others? And now you actually come here to pretend to be an immortal? Taoist Sin was embarrassed. He originally wanted to cause trouble for soup woman Meng, but when he saw Lu Xiaoyi, it was already too late. He could only brace himself and walk over. It was really embarrassing to be seen by his companions in such a situation. Moreover, it was obvious that he would never be able to raise his head in front of this swordsman. I'm ashamed. I wanted to take a shortcut, but I didn't expect to be caught red-handed. It's also my luck. Lu Xiaoyi saw that he was embarrassed and somewhat unwilling to talk about the situation. He didn't force him to talk about the details, but there was one thing he had to ask clearly. Who is that soup woman Meng? Don't tell me you don't know her. Taoist Sin was still hemming and hawing. In fact, with his knowledge and experience, there were still people among the demigods who could be forcefully taken down by others. For example, Lu Xiaoyi. However, it was a little inconceivable that someone had done this to her without anyone knowing. Lu Xiaoyi didn't let him off. You like to drink spicy soup so much, it has nothing to do with me. But I want to know who she is. If we meet again in the future, I'll be prepared. In the future, the immortal court will be in chaos, and there will be more and more important people coming down. I don't want to be unknowingly stabbed in the back. Taoists sighed. It's Fairy Hengji, the owner of the Great Crimson Sky Nether Floating Palace. Chapter 2396. Lu Xiaoyi sighed. He knew that this was the case. Half-immortals like them could not do what Fairy Hengji did. Their abilities were sealed tightly and could not be used in the underworld. It was even more impossible to create an image projection like this fairy, a Tao realm illusion. Of course, even immortals could not escape the restrictions of the golden immortals here. The Netherworld Palace in Great Scarlet Sky was the lowest level of human immortals. Taoist Sin was not willing to say anything more detailed. It seemed like it was a personal matter. They had worked together in Great Scarlet Sky before. Saying that they had an affair might be an exaggeration, but it was certain that there were some unclear connections. The reason why Taoist Sin was in this state was probably because there was a story behind it. However, Taoist Sin was very sure, she has no evil intentions towards us. Of course, under the rules of the golden immortals in the underworld, she is not allowed to use such a method to threaten our lives. Therefore, when you broke her Tao of reincarnation, she naturally retreated. What I want to say is that even without the rules of the golden immortals, she is not a person who kills indiscriminately. Moreover, doing so would not benefit her. After pausing, he decided to remind Lu Xiaoyi, in the immortal court, the core ideology is very pure. To them, they would not use their identity as immortals to fight with the half-immortals of the lower realm. If they do so, no matter what they do, it will only bring harm to them. They will only set up. Then, after their Tao disappears, they will use some method to attach themselves to the half-immortal body. Only then will it be time for them to fight without any restraint. Only then will the fight be meaningful. Soon, you will see that the next batch of monsters will gradually appear among the half-immortals in the cultivation world. However, the difference between them and the previous batch is that it is hard to say who is behind this batch of monsters. In terms of time, the most suitable time to appear is 1,000 years before the new era. It should be from the collapse of the 24th grade Tao, right? That is the end of the universe's transformation. A large batch of cultivators with exceptionally powerful Tao realm, experience, and battle abilities will appear. They might be unfamiliar to you, or they might be among your friends. You have to be careful of these people, they are our true opponents. Lu Xiaoyi looked at him with disdain. Old Sin, don't talk about us. Speaking of which, you're considered part of their circle, right? I bet you'll say the same about us when we meet in your circle. Taoists laughed awkwardly. It's all the same, all the same. The universe was about to change, and everyone had the right to survive. You half-immortals have them, so why can't the immortals of the immortal court have them? There was no such thing as being orthodox or not. They were all pursuers of the great Tao. It was just that their methods were different. Don't you think we should go and get the Chakravarti king? That thing has caused me a lot of suffering. Lu Xiaoyi was indifferent. You solve your own problems. I've already dealt with 7 of them, and you can't even deal with 3. How are you going to split the merit? I'll leave the Chakravarti king to you. You can do whatever you want with him. When you return, remember to find a ghost messenger to serve you. I've been laughing so hard that my face has turned stiff. Also, I need to find a place to relieve myself. Taoists shook his head. I've seen cooks steal food, but I've never seen anyone steal Granny Meng's soup. How many bowls have you secretly drunk while I'm queuing up here? Also, your hands are shaking when you're serving soup. Lu Xiaoyi didn't look ashamed. If my hands don't shake, would I be the one serving soup? It's such a long journey. You should at least prepare some deep-fried dough cakes and pan-fried buns so that we can hurry along. Taoists turned and left. You don't have to worry. I'll be able to drink milk soon. It's more nutritious than this. Lu Xiaoyi continued to serve as the one serving soup on the bridge of helplessness. It seemed that the living souls weren't used to Granny Meng turning into Lord Lu. This was obviously inconsistent with the folklore. Could it be that the business on the bridge of helplessness was still a husband and wife business? The old woman went home to boil soup, and the old man stayed here for a while. After drinking a few more bowls of spicy soup, he felt his entire body sweating and relaxed. It was a pity that the food in his storage ring was all meat products, but he didn't prepare any pancakes. What a pity! In the future, when I go out and brag to others and ask you what special breakfast you've eaten, I'll eat pancakes on the bridge of helplessness and eat Granny Meng's soup. If word gets out, I'll crush everything. While his imagination was running wild, Taoists quickly returned. There were 3 official seals hanging from his waist, and behind him was a ghost servant who was unscathed from the purge. At last, Lu Xiaoyi was able to shake off his role as Granny Meng. All the living souls who left also drank a full bowl of spicy soup instead of less than half a bowl. The 2 of them stood in the sky above the sky pit, where the living souls had already begun to wander aimlessly. Daoistsen said worriedly, "We have to establish a new order as soon as possible. Otherwise, the underworld will quickly become chaotic and disorderly. We're here to earn merit, not to get into trouble. It's impossible that the Golden Immortals don't know about the changes in the underworld. The reason why they don't ask is because they're waiting for us to come up with a new order and rule. If they're satisfied, we'll consider it a success. If they're not satisfied, we'll have made a wasted trip." "Who knows, we might even get into trouble." Lu Xiaoyi nodded in agreement. "Let's first let the remaining ghost servants maintain the order. It should be barely enough, right? Isn't there still King Qingguang? Nearly half of the ghost servants in his palace have been preserved. He can be considered a person who can take care of himself. For such a person, we still have to set an example." Daoistsen sighed. He had automatically placed himself in the position of a subordinate. This was a self-awareness that a high-level cultivator must have. Firstly, he had received far more official seals from swordsmen than he did. Secondly, he had to rely on Daoistsen's help to escape from his predicament. Although it wasn't a life-saving grace, he had truly crossed a huge hurdle. He had to acknowledge this favor. "Escort C, take the lead. I'll do my best to assist." Lu Xiaoyi unexpectedly rejected his tactfulness. "No, it's best if you take the lead. But as for the rules, let's discuss it. I'll come up with an idea. What do you think?" Daoistsen was somewhat surprised, but he quickly reacted. He had learned a lot about this swordsman over the years. The more he learned, the more surprised he was. The more he learned, the more he couldn't understand him. He was very clear that at their level, there was no such thing as modesty. "What I deserve is mine." This was the true attitude of a cultivator. If the swordsman was being modest, then there must be a deeper meaning behind it. Daoistsen didn't need to ask, nor did he want to ask. He was afraid of getting into trouble. He only needed to listen to the arrangements. As for the so-called discussion, it was just a polite way of saying it. To put it bluntly, the swordsman was the one who came up with the idea. He was the puppet, and the swordsman was the mastermind behind the scenes. "All right. I'll take the lead. Escort C, what ideas do you have? Let's hear it." Lu Xiaoyi smiled. "When I was a monarch, I traveled the universe. I've seen a lot of things. One of them was a place called the Ferris Wheel. I found it very interesting. Oldson, have you ever been to an amusement park? You're tuning in to the Phoenix Nights YouTube channel. Don't forget to subscribe and join us on this journey to catch the most captivating stories.